Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Adrienne Keyser, and I'm your over 50s fashion diva. Here on my channel, we talk about fashion, of course, but also beauty, lifestyle, travel, and anything trending in social media and any of those topics. So if you want to stay relevant over 50, then you come to the right place. Tonight is gonna be a good movie night, but it's a long movie night. So buckle up. I hope you guys are ready because I am super excited about tonight. I'm gonna go ahead and dive in with my adult grape juice. I decided to start putting it in a cup so that the algorithm gods don't get me. Grape juice. I decided to start putting it in a cup. Oh, sorry. Anyway, I know I'm looking rough. That's because I put on this makeup thinking that I was going to be doing some filming today, and I never got around to it. I've been sitting on my computer doing Canva all day. So, but we do have a really long movie night, which means it's going to be a lot of good self care. Now, for me, I do live in Belize, lighting our incense, getting our mood started. I do live in Belize, so it's only 7:30 for me. So I'm actually going to be making and eating dinner while I'm going through all of the movie. And I'm going to be doing a lot of self care tonight. I'm going to be doing some face masks. And by the way, tomorrow is National Face Mask Day. So I will possibly be doing a live. I haven't decided yet, but I wanted to celebrate it in some way. So we shall see. Hopefully, I'm not burning my table here. All right. Incense is lit. And we're going to go ahead and take off my makeup. I'm going to be doing all kinds of different face masks. As I said, I'm going to be doing this hand mask that I picked up on Amazon ages ago. And I mentioned it in my last movie night that I was going to be doing this mask, hand mask, and also this Bliss holographic foil sheet mask. I'm not really a sheet mask girl. I'm going to be honest. But I've had this thing for so long. I'm like, okay, fashion movie night is the perfect night to do it. I am going to be doing a peel mask. I'll probably do a steam. I'll probably do my LED mask, my lip LED mask, and a ton of moisturizer steps. And make sure that you join me next week because I'm going to be doing needling, which is something that I did about a week ago. I forgot about needling. It's such a good step, especially for us babes over 50, to get that moisturizer really penetrated deep into the skin. So since I just did it, I don't want to do it again for at least another week. So come back next week for fashion movie night. I'll teach you guys all about needling. And if you don't know, you'll learn next week. I'm also going to touch up my nails. I mean, I'm going to be doing a ton of stuff. So tonight's movie night is all about Elsa Schiaparelli. If you didn't see the thumbnail, if you didn't see any of the millions of places that I posted it up for this evening, then yeah, that is the movie that we're going to be doing tonight. Oh, I'm also going to be doing a hair mask. I just got this in from Amazon from the States, my Shea Moisture. This is the Advanced Honey and Manuka Oil Intensive Hydration Hair Mask. So I'm going to be doing all those things, all the things tonight, all the things. So let's go ahead, dive in. Oh, that's my timer to let me know that my oven is ready. I'm making pizza. A frozen pizza, but I always add a little extra toppings to make it delicious. I just washed my hands, so I'm gonna go ahead, take off my makeup. If you haven't seen any of my skincare routines, I literally just did them not too long ago. So make sure that you check those out. I'll try to leave a link in the description box for you. I'm going to start off with this Awaken Apricot Cleansing Oil and the Revolution. This is the Makeup Remover Spray. So I'm going to start with those two products. Then I'm going to go off camera, stick the pizza in the oven, and use my Awaken Collagen Cleansing Foam. Now, if you do follow me on social media, and I hope that you do, and if you don't, please do. I am trying to grow on Instagram and TikTok. So please make sure to follow me there. I always leave links to my social medias in the description box. I just did a IG live last night doing an Amazon unboxing, which was awesome. I had so much fun. I got so many end of season sandals. Oh, it was such a good unboxing. But of course, I'm going to do a whole different video for you guys here on YouTube, all about the new sandals that I just picked up for the end of summer. And let's see, what else can I say before we get this movie started? I wanted to kind of go, all right, we're about 6 minutes in. We got to get started. So I'm going to start the movie. I already have it ready to go. I'm going to close out these other boxes. I made sure to clear my cache and browsing data, everything, and restart my computer before we started. So there should be no interruptions for our movie. I have the movie set up ready to go. And let's see. All right, sharing screen. So I'm going to come back to StreamYard. Let's take a peek. And I swear tomorrow I am purchasing the full StreamYard. I'm purchasing the full StreamYard. So hopefully it'll be much better quality. We'll be able to stream things in a different way. We'll be set up much better. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead, get started. I'll try to hold up products as I go along of what I'm using, and let's get started. Elsa Schiaparelli, the life and death of Elsa Schiaparelli. Oh, and by the way, one more thing. If you saw the Alexander McQueen movie night, which was the very first movie night that I did, this is by the same exact creator. So you know it's going to be very thorough. She's going to have a lot of great information. And she also credits everyone that she gets her information from. So please make sure to go and watch the Alexander McQueen one because it was epic. She did an amazing job. So as soon as I saw that she did one for Schiaparelli, I immediately put it in my watch later list. So, all right, here we go. Elsa.
Elsa Schiaparelli is one of the most well-respected designers ever to have existed. But few people know the intricacies of her life. Her own autobiography, though entertaining, is full of half-truths and hyperbole in her much-loved manner. So today, I wanted, as a celebration of my 2-year YouTube anniversary and hopefully as a celebration of 100,000 subscribers, take a deep dive into her entire life and demystify all the different intricacies of this incredible woman. Much like with all of my biographies, of which this is the 4th, these are the books that I referenced in the video, and the cover will be on the top left for easy referencing. On screen will be lots of bonus facts about Schiaparelli, the places, her friends, family, etc. I'd also really like to say a quick thank you to David Santamaria and Perry Picasso, both artists and designers who helped by illustrating a few of the more important Schiaparelli designs that are unfortunately without pictures. The illustrations will come up where appropriate. Chapter 1. Childhood. When 50-year-old Celeste Schiaparelli's 35-year-old wife, Maria Luisa, was pregnant, he was sure she was about to have a boy. By the 10th of September 1890, he was disappointed. She birthed their second daughter and their last child together. 10 days later, the family walks north along the Tiber River in Rome up the cobblestone to St. Peter's Basilica, where together with their daughter Beatrice, her wet nurse, and a priest, they realize they haven't even considered a name for the newborn. Elsa, the wet nurse, proposes her own, and the baby is christened Elsa Luisa Maria Schiaparelli in the first of many childhood disappointments. Scap, as she prefers to be known, was born to an objectively wealthy and academically successful family. Born inside their family home of Palazzo Corsini in the Travestere, which was the oldest and most Roman of all the districts in Rome, their home was an extremely large, late Baroque-style building that overlooked the Tiber River and was clearly within walking distance of St. Peter's, which is located in what we know today as Vatican City. In fact, this home was already famous by this time thanks to guests Erasmus, Michelangelo, and the Queen Christina of Sweden, who, when she abdicated in 1659 after converting to Catholicism, chose to live in the adjoining Villa Farnesina for 30 years. Scap's family wealth really came from both sides. Her father was a scholar who had come from the House of Savoy in Piedmont, and as such, his lineage was a prominent family of wealth and academia, most of whom needing to speak multiple languages. His older brother, Giovanni, was an astronomer that had become famous for his unfortunately now disproven discovery of canals and signs of habitation on Mars, as well as the still believed to be factual connection between comets and meteors. His sister was the head of all of the convents in Italy. His cousin Luigi founded the Schiaparelli Foundation, organizing religious missions for Christianity, and his other cousin Ernesto was an Egyptologist who discovered Nefertiti's grave in the Valley of the Queens and was monumental in securing agreements between Egypt and abroad museums to use their artifacts for display. By which I mean he had the sole permission to take entire tombs and their contents outside of Egypt for museums.
Wow.
Which is seen as a bad thing now, but then was very important to raise tourism interest in Egypt. Meanwhile, Celestino himself had become respected in his own right for both his specialist knowledge of the Islamic world of the Middle Ages and for his job as the librarian for the fairly newly formed Academy of Linsai, which today is the oldest and most prestigious association serving the humanities in Europe, which even then in its foundation saw that he had a very prestigious job that came with a handsome apartment as well as free reign of the Palazzo Corsini that housed the legendary Linsai Library, which is how Schiaparelli was able to be born there. He ran in highbrow circles and was a good friend of King Victor Emmanuel II, sharing the hobby of collecting ancient coins and trading them together. Clearly, he was a very important man at a very important time in Rome. Meanwhile, on her mother's side, her lineage was equally as impressive. Her father, Alberto de Dominitis, was a marquis and the Italian consul in Malta, as well as an advisor to the Khedive in Egypt, who was so important that they had a grand procession for him following his death, carrying his body to a specialized grave in Egypt. Meanwhile, her mother, Maria Luisa, was the famously beautiful daughter of a British governor in Malta who could trace his lineage back to the southern aristocrats of Naples, descendants of the Dukes of Tuscany. This side of her family was famed for being extrovert, inventive, poetic, superstitious, melancholic, and adventurous. So, Scap, from a very young age, was born to true generational wealth. And it's certainly clear where she gets her juxtapositionally academically strict side and extroverted side of her personality from. But amongst all of this prosperity, all of this wealth, the thing that she really remembers from her childhood was that she was very much born into neglect. She seems to recall her parents just not being around enough, and throughout her biography, Scap tells fantastical stories of her childhood that paint a picture of just how desolate her experience was emotionally. Though this is disputed in other accounts, she recalls that her father was scholarly to a fault. He spent little time with his family entirely, while it seems her mother was really quite cruel verbally. As a result, she would partake in strange tricks or attention-grabbing acts in order to get the attention from them that she so desperately craved. Truthfully, it is hard to know exactly which of these stories are conclusively true. Quote, when Schiaparelli came to write her memoir in 1954, she was well known for her promotional skills, so it is impossible to know how much actually happened and what was invented. She also had little other written correspondence with people, kept no diary that we know of, and even those that knew her said she was particularly aloof with details of her own life, as if she was always keeping something back. Still, there are many believable and almost believable stories woven in with the hyperbole. For example, Schiap writes that when she was born, it caused an explosion across Rome. This obviously was not true, but the explosion was real. It happened a while after her birth when the powder worlds of São Paulo blew up. She also claims to have taken a large umbrella to use as a parachute out of a third-story window, which saw her land in a pile of manure, which is technically possible, but probably hyperbole, considering at the very least there is no reason for a pile of manure to be outside a window in the Palazzo Corsini, and she claimed that she had jumped into a swimming pool of quicklime, causing herself severe burns, which is far less likely to have happened. Even if she was lucky enough to have somebody on hand to pull her out, where would this swimming pool of quicklime come from? However, what stands to be true from all of these stories is that she simply wanted to be seen, something she was certainly not getting from her parents, and in fact something she would soon begin to blame on her lacking childhood beauty. This obsession with beauty really began with stories of their familial beauty as hereditary, starting with her maternal grandmother, evidenced to Schiap through photographs, because she actually died at the age of 20 when her daughter, so Schiap's mother, was only 10. The beauty was then passed down to her maternal aunt, Zia, who was apparently so calm and stunning that men would kill themselves in vain, and monks themselves thought that she was Satan, for her beauty was so inhuman. But, unlike her grandmother, Schiap actually did meet Zia, and she was exceptionally kind. She would send material and trinkets to the family from Egypt, where she lived, and because of how deprived of affection she felt she was, a young Schiap came to really idolize her and her beauty. Unfortunately, however, despite how desperately Schiap wanted to be like Zia, her sister Beatrice, by the time Schiap was born, had already adopted the spot as the family's next reigning beauty. Beatrice was about 8 or 9 years older than Schiap, and they shared a bedroom, but the sisters were never close. Of course, this could be simply due to the age gap, but it could not have helped that Elsa was constantly compared to her sister by literally everyone in her family. She was told she was too thin, too difficult, too ugly, bug-eyed, all by her own family. Comments that would go on to affect her relationship with them, as well as her relationship with herself, from then all up until the day that she died. This is also where her most famous childhood tale would find its moral. In this story, Schiap, desperate to beautify herself, coerced nasturtium, daisy and morning glory seeds from the gardener and planted them in every facial orifice she had, up her nose, down her throat, in her ears, in the hopes that when they grew, she would become as beautiful as a flower in bloom. However, rather quickly, she realized she could not breathe. She panicked, she called out for help, and eventually came 2 doctors who took 7 attempts to remove the seeds from her person. The reason this is her most famous story was because this would be monumentally influential in her life, even in her and her friends' work as artists, notably in Dali, who used this motif multiple times in his work. But interestingly, despite how hyperbolic it seems, this story is really believed to be true. As Myrtle Secrets writes, this kind of detail would suggest that such an event really happened. So, Schiap was emotionally lonely. She grew up in a rigid social environment in a particularly religious area, with people who were then seen to be elderly parents that just didn't understand her. It wasn't that they didn't love her, that they were actively cruel to her, past the snipes about her appearance, nor is it conclusively true that they weren't around when she needed them. It's just that there was too much protocol and tradition holding them back for her to feel any other kind of way. She just couldn't get close to them. So, much like many lonely children living nigh alone in a palace, of which I'm sure there are many, she begins exploring. Soon she would find both books and, in the attic, clothes. Specifically, she found her mother's wedding dress and a lace cushion to which she would use to beautify herself, spending hours alone turning it from dress to dress, long skirt to short skirt. Though it should be pointed out that this was all styling at this point. She never really learned how to sew. She even mocks herself for it in interviews in later life. But this is really how she spent her time until around 1896, when she finally began religious instruction in the convent of the Lucchesi, which, after such a long period of loneliness, offered her her first real connection to other people. It was common in those days for only the daughters of well-to-do families to be sent to these kinds of religious preparatory schools. But it wasn't quite how Schiap had hoped. It was parochial, single-sex, and a dreary place, mostly meant to teach compliance. It was at this school that she first kissed a boy, just an innocent first kiss between children, but not really understanding this, Elsa expressed that she had fornicated in a confession to a priest, who, despite knowing that she didn't understand what she had said, and seeing that she was in distress about it, considering that she fainted, concluded that she had still sinned and berated her to the extent that it scarred her emotionally for life, causing her to be particularly guarded of her emotions and to become non-religious.
I'm just going to pause it right there for a quick second just to say I am so sorry that I missed the very beginnings of this where it talked about her family and all that, but I'll have to watch it on the replay. I hope you guys learned a lot. So far, I'm completely fascinated. This is so good. All right, let's go.
So she just didn't last here long before frictions arose and her parents instead placed her into a Protestant school, which unfortunately was stricter. But even here, unfortunately for Schiap, was not the best environment as she finally joined her sister in education, causing her to become more upset at their visual differences. But actually, this experience did also draw the two closer after they joined forces to feed their mother the school's soup, which they hated being forced to eat at lunch. Their mother was horrified at the quality, and they were henceforth both sent with packed lunches. So except for that one positive story she has of the school, she really found no solace here. She found no solace at home either, and really the only solace she had in any of this time were the summers. Her family, when Rome overheated, travelled across Italy, either to Tivoli, overlooking the Villa d'Este or Hadrian's Wall. They also travelled once to Tunisia when she was 13, during which her father refused her to marry one of the most powerful Arabs in all the land, or they would travel to her astrologer uncle Giovanni's Napoleonic villa near Milan on the shores of Lake Como. In fact, she notes how her happiest times were visiting her uncle Giovanni here in Milan. It was here she would learn about the stars with his enormous telescopes, and she would listen to his stories about the inhabitants of Mars. He would encourage her to create stories, dreams, poetry, and even try further out things like reincarnation, astrology, palmistry, telepathy, mediums, and the power of spiritualism, all of which would make a huge impression on the young girl.
Sorry, I promise I'm not going to do a lot of breaks since it's such a long movie. But I did want to make mention that this up here in the top, if you didn't notice, that is the reference for each of the topics that she's talking about. She always puts the reference there at the top corner. So if you are interested in finding out more about her, you can always go and check out this creator's, what is her name? I can't remember her name, what the channel's name is, but you could always go and check out the channel. I'm sure that she's got it all listed there. So, all right, no more pauses for now. I promise. Well, maybe. We shall see. Keeping going.
But mostly, it's believed she liked her time with Giovanni in particular because she trusted him, evidenced in one noticeable bout of sadness where she confided in him all of her physical insecurities. Her nose and upper lip were too long, her mouth was too wide, her chin too firmly set, and she hated her 7 moles on her left cheek that cascaded down her chin. She told him this, fully expecting him to confirm, as her parents might have done. But instead of confirming her ugliness, he told her they were placed exactly like the constellation called the Great Bear, and that she was unique and lucky to have had such a distinguished and fortunate mark. Soon, with her childhood years behind her, Elsa had turned 18 in 1908 and was finally permitted a substantial monthly allowance, which in Schiaparelli's memoir she says the raise in her pocket money was to 50 lira a week, which, if inflationhistory.com is correct, meant she was seeing more than 250 euros a week pocket money.
That's a lot.
This she would use on clothing, with the same mentality she once had dressing up in the attic. She used the funds to pay for anything outside of her mother's taste, so tartans with black and velvet collars, large brown hats trimmed with a wide yellow bow, and invariably more colours in her wardrobe than her mother thought was tasteful. Meanwhile, her father would begin taking her out to the theatre, which she seemed to quite enjoy, both for getting to wear her nice new clothing and for she truly did enjoy the opera. Though all of these trips and these clothes did very little to end her growing boredom of life in general. Days turned into weeks, into months, into a year. By the time she was 19, she was uncharacteristically for the time completely disinterested in marriage and was far more interested in just expressing herself. This she would do through writing. She penned articles on music, concerts, and opera, though because she had no technical knowledge, nor could she sing herself, though she desperately wished she could, they could simply not be classed as criticism because of it. They were unconventional and entertaining, though, and as such, a few were printed in magazines. Finally, it seems she truly found her sense of fulfillment in life. Not just writing, of course, but being creative. After all these years of looking in religion, into family, into order, she found what she really needed in creativity and freedom. As such, she began to wonder if philosophy would be suited to her and began a course in the University of Rome, which she absolutely adored. By the time Schiap was 20, her father finally retired from his job and, as a workaholic at around 70, moved into a new position as the Dean of the University of Rome. Because their home was tied to his job, the family then had to move from their palatial home to somewhere much smaller in the Piazza Santa Maria Maggiore, which didn't enchant Schiap the way that the previous home did, as there was less to explore in general and no gardens to roam. Though it should be noted that it was still rather sprawling and was the newly constructed Via Nazionale, but it was just the comparison that really dulled her experience. Interestingly, in her memoir, she claims that she was pretty miserable here, though the far more comprehensive biography of White claims much to the opposite. As I mentioned earlier, the dueling timelines, in fact, have been throughout her entire biography so far. She importantly claimed multiple things that just don't seem necessarily to be true, one of which comes exactly at this point. She says he was much older than her and yet was a close friend, for he channeled the same artistic encouragement that her uncle Giovanni did, flattering her by borrowing the poems that she wrote and encouraging her.
Sorry about that. I noticed StreamYard did a little hiccup, so I'm going to back it up just a little bit.
Palatial home to somewhere much smaller in the Piazza Santa Maria Maggiore, which didn't enchant Schiap the way that the previous home did, as there was less to explore in general and no gardens to roam. Though it should be noted that it was still rather sprawling and was the newly constructed Via Nazionale, but it was just the comparison that really dulled her experience. Interestingly, in her memoir, she claims that she was pretty miserable here, though the far more comprehensive biography of White claims much to the opposite. As I mentioned earlier, the dueling timelines, in fact, have been throughout her entire biography so far. She importantly claimed multiple things that just don't seem necessarily to be true, one of which comes exactly at this point. In her biography, she claimed that when she was 15, so 5 years before where we are at now in the timeline, she grew close to her cousin Attilio. She says he was much older than her and yet was a close friend, for he channeled the same artistic encouragement that her uncle Giovanni did, flattering her by borrowing the poems that she wrote and encouraging her creative sensibility. These, according to her autobiography, he took to Quintieri in Milan to have them published into a book called Arethusa that was extremely successful. She claims her family were horrified and embarrassed by this, especially because it was successful, and she was temporarily exiled to a convent in German Switzerland as punishment. However, this story is another half-truth, as the book was actually published when she was 21 in 1911, hence why I waited until now to tell you about it. So what is much more likely is that either her parents have read some kind of manuscript back in 1905, 1906, and it was at that point that she was shipped off to the convent, as it was strict and had little to offer in terms of poetic sensibility, or that she was sent to the convent at the age of 21, for the book was an expression of passion, which was very taboo for any woman still in 1911. The fact that the book was popular upon release, however, seems to be extremely true. You can still see the title page if you Google the name Arethusa today, though I couldn't find the whole book itself, which I honestly think is just a really big shame. In lieu of this, White offers a couple reviews of the book from its release. So I'm going to read you the whole quote. Arethusa was reviewed in most of the Italian papers and was mentioned in English and German periodicals. Some of the verse translated into Spanish, which was included in an anthology of Italian poems published in Madrid, despite receiving some criticism for being too abstract, speculative, and pessimistic. The collection was acknowledged to be lively and elegant. Salome, the first and best of the poems, was praised as a lyrical meditation on love, the soul, and the problems of the mind and spirit. Roma Literaria spoke of the new and stupendous pathos. Populo Romano commented, all Elsa Schiaparelli's poetry is profoundly human and essentially emotional. She looks for beauty in every drop of rain, every ray of sun, every leaf that trembles, every flame that scintillates. In regards to the convent, she was also only there for approximately 99 days, having experienced excommunication, various strange rules, and unfair, harsh punishments. She sent help via a friend who happened to be the Prime Minister's daughter, which prompted her dad to come and see the horrid conditions she was living in, and that his daughter was nearing the end of a fatally risking hunger strike, for which he removed her from the school. By the time she returned, she was around the age of 22, and her romantic appetite had finally somewhat heightened. But her visions of her future husband and her parents' vision of her future husband didn't exactly align. Literally none of the men that her parents truly wanted her to marry showed any semblance of interest, which resulted in her first proposal coming from an incredibly wealthy but much older Russian man who she didn't like and her parents thought was too old. So at least on this, they agreed. Following him, she had kind of given up on connective marriages and ended up seeing men for her attraction to them instead, as opposed to financial planning. There was a painter who she fell in love with, but he was already otherwise betrothed, and more notably a man from Naples who was both intelligent and warm. The boy, whose name was Pino, had travelled all the way from Naples to Rome to woo the young Scap with a box of tuberoses. She really and truly fell for Pino hard, to the point that you should remember his name throughout this story. But Pino was poor. Her parents adamantly disapproved, and after an exceptionally short fling, they sent him away. Schiaparelli never forgot this, and literally never forgave her parents for it either. Unfortunately, his name doesn't come up very much in her autobiography, nor in other tales, but for something we'll discuss much later in the story, it was clear that this relationship meant more to her than she could possibly have known at this time. Unfortunately, it was following this heartbreak that the frail but wealthy Russian man with his slanting eyes and rounded beard returned to Rome, this time actively seeking approval for her hand in marriage. It's just this time, her parents were not against it. He had money, and in those days and in their circles, it was still a good reason to marry if she couldn't find somebody otherwise perfect. He tried to get Scap on board, writing letters and staring at her, gifting her jewels inherited from his mother, and unceasingly requesting her hand. Her parents, too, were beginning to get pushy with it, and Scap felt that she was being suffocated. So she left. She hooked on to a friend of her sister who was offering a position helping to care for orphans in London, and so on a whim, she left Italy, vowing never to return. Chapter 2. London, Paris, America. Love, marriage, divorce. As it was 1913, there was no direct train to London via Italy, and so Scap's train was actually bound to Paris before she could transfer onto her London destination. Here, while she had the opportunity, she decided it would be a good idea to spend a good 10 days to soak up the city. This was really the heyday of Paris. It was seeing a new wave of prosperity following the Exposition of 1900 that meant Paris was newly the epicenter of feminine decorative style that would make Paris the center of the artistic and fashionable worlds. To quote Colin Jones, who was quoted by Seacrest, the Exposition put the spotlight on the city as the home of the modernist good life. A heady consumerist mix including bright fabrics, haute couture, pattern wallpapers, bicycles, cameras, sewing machines, and sun-dry home comforts available through the Grand Magasin. In short, by the time Schiaparelli arrived, Paris was the place to be. For the next 10 days, she roamed the streets, soaked up the art for which she had an interest in Parisian cubism, fauvism, and futurism, and enjoyed the many cafes and sights of Paris. She had a wonderful time in Paris. So, when on her final night, by chance, she met a family friend called Alberto Rombroso, an Italian in Paris working as a historian specializing on Napoleon, who invited her to a true Parisian party that evening, how could she say no? The party was at the home of a famous couple with the last name Henrot, who lived on the 16th arrondissement, meaning it was sure to be an extravagant affair. But for such an event, she had nothing to wear. Italy was far behind Paris in terms of fashion, while here, thanks to Paul Poiret, the skirts had heightened, the corsets abandoned, and Orientalism was all the rage following the Ballet Russe production of Scheherazade. Scap would need something to compete, a softer silhouette in brighter colors, and she thought she could make it. Bear in mind, this was a young woman who knew she had no sewing skills and was looking to make a dress to compete with the Parisian ladies' haute couture, so she must have had enormous gumption to lead herself down to Galerie Lafayette to buy 4 yards of heavy dark blue crepe de chine for 10 francs a yard and 2 yards of orange silk to sew her own outfit, the very first Schiaparelli design. It resulted in a zouave version of a Poiret pantaloon. The dark blue crepe de chine was pinned around her body, while the orange silk became a high-waisted sash, the turban. By the evening of the party, the dress was ready. It turned heads. People seemed to really enjoy what she had put together. But during a particularly fervent tango, the dress rather quickly untangled itself from the pins holding it together, and it began to fall off the young woman. Quickly ushered aside by her tactful dance partner, she dashed outside to make a quick exit. But she had made the impression she wanted to make, and ended up incredibly proud of herself for becoming the liberated woman that she had experienced the evening before continuing her trip to England. It was here that she loved the English fog, Green Park, and the threat of being pickpocketed, which she herself said may have come from reading one too many Sherlock Holmes novels, and she travelled often between the English countryside, where she was helping the children in need, which was still her primary goal for her trip, and the city of London. It was here that soon she became enticed to attend a lecture one day after seeing a poster in the fog. It was a lecture on theosophy, which then was a kind of mystical teaching, part Buddhism, part magic, not the religion known today in the US, but in fact was something she was predisposed to enjoy thanks to her uncle Giovanni. When she arrived, she discovered that the lecture was said to be held by a Comte Wilhelm Frederick Vendant de Curler, who was witty, charming, and overtly charismatic in his teachings. He was tall, slim, and elegant in his Slavic good looks. though the tall part is disputed by Sechrist because he was 5'6" at most. Regardless, Schiap was immediately smitten. So much so that by the end of the lecture, she was totally unable to stand, remaining in her seat until an attendant asked if she would like to meet the lecturer. There's no note to what actually happened in their greeting, but little is left to the imagination, as by the next morning, the pair were engaged. Of course, Schiap's parents were mortified. The man was 30 and Schiap only 23, and set to inherit a decent fortune. But by the time they arrived in London to stop the marriage, it was too late. Wilhelm and Schiap were wedded in the Registry Office of St. Martin's District, London, on the 21st of July, 1914. After the wedding, they went back to his tiny, furnished mews house, and to Schiap's surprise and fearfully superstitious personality, all of the 7 mirrors that he owned were cracked. Finding information on Wilhelm for historians has been particularly tricky. He was not named in her autobiography, and it seems without extensive research, primarily conducted by Palmer White, that even his name would be unknown. As it is, today we do have his name and even this image, the sole remaining image of the man, but details of their marriage are still really quite mysterious. We know from White that de Curler was Breton French on his father's side and French-Swiss on his mother's. Also, by marrying him, Schiap attained the title of Countess, though it's rather unclear how. Furthermore, recent research for later records of his naturalization in the US don't show de Curler then claimed his title as Count, despite regularly using pseudonyms or variations on his name with various false titles such as Doctor or Professor. So that, still today, is a true mystery. More importantly, de Curler was known to be a bit of a nut for the paranormal. It was of interest in the early 1900s, and he was a big proponent of it in London. He read palms, had a magazine named The Occult Review, and made predictions on the side. But by the time war broke out, only days after their marriage, something he was exempt from serving in due to his birth in Switzerland, he began publishing monthly astrological forecasts of the war in his magazine and constantly claimed he was accurate to the point of newsworthy fame. This was bolstered by his Mayfair address, which saw him perceived as wealthy and successful to those inquiring. The truth, of course, was that his office was barely in the wealthy area of Piccadilly, as it was in Piccadilly Place, which was a small, down-market alleyway that was cheap and scammy in comparison. Not that that mattered if he had the Mayfair telephone number, though. However, with all of that said, the one thing he did not predict was his humiliating demise in the London circles. By the spring of 1915, only a year after his marriage, he was sentenced to 6 weeks in prison and then deportation under the Vagrancy Act for fortune-telling, which was illegal as it was seen to deceive and impose on His Majesty's subjects. Humiliated, the new couple had only a weekend to pack and together were forced to leave England on Monday, the 12th of July 1915, destined back to France. But not to Paris. Because of the war, it was simply too dangerous in Paris, and so they followed the French government to Bordeaux, where it was perceived to be safer. Though even this didn't last long, and they ended up moving again to the Boulevard du Moulin in Cannes, where de Curler's parents lived. Though it seems perhaps they shortly moved again to Nice, as per White's book and her memoir, though not all sources are conclusive on that. Either way, Schiap hated it here as well. She spent her days waiting for her disappointment of a husband and ended up going too frequently to Monte Carlo, where she gambled away her entire fortune to the point that the casino on one of her final days had to give her a railway voucher for her return journey, stamped with their compliments, of course. With that said, incredibly fortunately, the one thing she did not touch was her dowry, which it reads as if she just couldn't spend, as she was now knowingly in the throes of a gambling addiction, something she was never truly able to shake. As a result, the years after she spent all of their money is completely undocumented. Whether this is from shame or secrecy, we just cannot know. But a full 3.5 years pass before any source returns to her timeline. You see, now penniless, save her dowry, they crossed the Atlantic on the SS Chicago in a move to New York, where they lived in a hotel near Madison Avenue. Scap again hated it, and they moved again to Brevoort in Greenwich Village, which she did finally like because, quote, they appeared to understand all of our difficulties and gave us the best lodging with the minimum expense. This was their 5th move in the last few years, but the hotel was distinguished and was well placed in New York to meet the kinds of wealthy men that DeCurler needed to know if he was to continue his shady practices across the pond. This also benefited Scap, of course. She was able to make friends of her own, including someone she had known from magazines, enjoyed in her younger years, named Gabrielle Picabia, who was close to the founders of Dadaism, and her husband, Francis Picabia, was launching a Dadaist review magazine named 391 around the same time. The women had found friendship on the SS Chicago based on their shared interest in modern art and their shared social position, both in need of cash, but also from the right social circles. As it was, they lost contact a little bit after the trip, only to be reconnected by a doctor due to their fortunately close living arrangements. This friendship obviously would go on to have an enormous impact throughout Schiaparelli's life. But in the meantime, her time at Greenwich Village also didn't last. The hotel was simply too expensive for the amount of money that her dowry provided, and they were going bankrupt quickly. As a result, by the autumn of 1917, they had to move once again to a place directly over the Café des Artistes at West 67th Street, just off of Central Park West. But to keep with the prestigious business location, they also opened a Bureau of Psychology at 501-502 373 Fifth Avenue, which effectively meant DeCurler was back in business. There's even pictures of DeCurler performing his psychic acts on his wife as promotional material that have still survived today. It's quite strange to see. As it was, he ended up being fairly publicly successful in New York, often in the paper for his predictions, despite the fact that they were illegal, but he was also rarely financially successful. So he and Elsa eventually had to leave their New York office when their monthly rent went from $125 to $150, which they simply could not afford. It also did not help that the Bureau of Investigation was always hot on their scamming tracks and made the couple dart between schemes, homes, and even in and out of New York entirely for the year or so following the war. A nomadic situation that became especially bad after DeCurler screwed up a police murder investigation in Boston that involved a suspected German espionage agent following the World War I years in which America and Germany were obviously enemies. By the autumn of 1919, Scap had grown well disillusioned by her husband. She had seen behind his cheap tricks and claims of the occult, and though she still believed in the practice, she did not believe in him. He was also ground to be unpredictable in his behavior and had awful mood swings that left a couple of writers, though most notably Sechrist, to believe that he may have been violent. Quote, she was living with a man whose lack of empathy and evasiveness in close relationships were equaled only by his clownish incompetence. He was a fraud. This unfortunately coincided with a dreamlike visit from her father, who sat at the foot of her bed in disappointment at what she had gotten into. Without saying a word, she knew then that he had actually passed away back in her Italian family home. The next day, on the 26th of October 1919, it was confirmed via a cable from Rome. This was really the final straw. Scap was unhappy, DeCurler was unhappy, they both wanted out. However, unfortunately, it was at this exact time that she fell pregnant and would soon give birth to their first child, Maria Luisa Yvonne Rata, on the 15th of June 1920. It seems likely that neither parent really wanted to have a child with the other, and it's even described as traumatic. Neither of them had the money to raise a child, they didn't have a place to live, and they didn't want to live together. Whatever plan they could possibly have would be arduous. In the end, they decided the best course of action was to separate. He was a trickster and a fraud, and a regular cheater, having multiple affairs, including one with Isadora Duncan. But this now meant that Scap was a single woman with a child, no job, and no place to live. She ended up staying in hotels, any one that she could afford, and would let her in with the child, which obviously was no easy feat. To secure a roof, she was forced to hide her daughter outside so that she could pay for the room before taking her daughter up later, then hanging her outside the window to try and get the young girl to stop crying. And if anyone did complain about the noise, she would seduce hotel managers just to avoid getting thrown onto the streets. Schiaparelli was desperately poor, desperately hungry, and desperately, desperately sad. It's understandable, therefore, that in order for Schiaparelli to make any kind of money, she would need a job. But in order to find one, she would need to leave her child at the hotel alone. To try to avoid noise complaints, she left her daughter on the fire escape to sleep in the sunshine while she went job hunting, and probably left the child alone and hungry for a very long time, as newborns are meant to have food every 2 hours.
You can't get away with
It's
that
regularly
today.
pointed out in almost every biography of her life that Schiaparelli was really not a good mother to her daughter. But it seems that even before her daughter was able to defend herself, this had started, albeit with at least a genuine excuse. Fortunately, good friend Gabrielle Picabia noticed the plight that Scap was in and offered to take her daughter for care. Gabby, as she preferred to be known, also had a newborn of her own, as well as 3 other children. But it seems that she was more than happy to help out her friend, who was clearly in genuine need. In fact, Gabby saw this as an opportunity, as she was in need of someone to help her with her trade as well. She'd purchased couture from Paris and was trying to find a charismatic helper to get the pieces sold in New York. Of course, Schiaparelli was rather perfect for the job, so what was one more little baby to look after while her new saleswoman was bringing in so much value? Together, they lived in Gabby's room at the Brevoort, and when they were both out, they shared the cost of a nursery so no child were left alone again. They began to meet the same friends, namely Marcel Duchamp, Alfred Stieglitz, Baron de Meyer, Edward Steichen, and even Man Ray. They were both well-liked women with good friends and seemed to be slowly but surely selling Gabby's dresses as well. Meanwhile, Man Ray was newly publishing his singular issue of New York Dada and needed Elsa to draw up mailing lists of prospective members and to make arrangements for things like meetings and exhibitions. So through her connections, Elsa finally had work and a little bit of money, even if she, Gabby, and their 5 combined children were still on the breadline. But, naturally, when that work dried up and all of Gabby's couture had sold, they were both back to square one. Though interestingly, she did have prospects. Given her husband's absence, she could have asked him for money, and now knowing that they were grandparents, her wealthy family were also trying to coerce her back to Italy with the promise of a luxurious life. But she wanted neither. She had seen the taste of an American freedom and wanted nothing less for herself and for her daughter. It seemed she had no other option than to swallow her pride and call her mother in Rome for financial help. From this point onwards, happy to help their new granddaughter, Scap received a small allowance from her mother, and though that didn't go far in the more expensive New York, she was able to use the money to find an affordable nurse in the Connecticut countryside who she could leave her daughter with. So at least for the short term, that was a weight off of her mind. By the time she was 30 in the winter of 1920, Elsa had also found more work, doing translations and part-time work for importing houses. She was then hired by a Wall Street broker to watch the ticker tape, though she was horrible at this job, got all the numbers wrong, and was quickly fired. And following that, she did a short period helping out with the charity American Relief Association. All of which before she met the particularly untalented soprano Kana Wolska, who was tone-deaf but wealthy. And so she could afford to pay for Scap to come as an assistant on a trip to perform in Havana, Cuba. And Schiaparelli, in need of money, jumped at the chance. Of course, Ghana was awful, she was booed off of stage, but Scap got paid and returned to New York in the spring of 1921 with money in her pocket. It was then she finally saw an uptick in her fortunes after she met the baritone singer and film star Mario Lorenzi. They were besotted. With so much in common, they were immediately drawn together. They both liked the Metropolitan Opera where he sang. They both came from Italy, and they were both currently in extremely unhappy but separated marriages. Their entrance into a relationship together was very quick and was also known across New York as a scandal due to the marital nature of both. Though it doesn't seem either of their partners minded that much because both were in relationships of their own as well. It's just that the real problem was that it opened the door to De Curler having reason to get sole custody of their daughter in their divorce, something that Elsa vehemently did not want. But unfortunately, things were only about to get worse for their young girl, who I should remind you was still living in the facility in Connecticut away from both parents. It was Elsa that realized on one of her trips that though she seemed healthy, she was not walking properly. She was obviously unwell, and when asked to the nurses about it, they simply said that it was a cold. Of course, Schiaparelli did not believe this and took her daughter to a specialist where she was told that the child had infantile paralysis, which we know now came from polio. Polio, of course, being linked to poor hygiene, evidence to the new mother that the nursing facility she had chosen was keeping child abuse from her. So, now in the best case scenario, her daughter may only have mild to no symptoms with effective and quick treatment, but in the worst case scenario, she could have full paralysis or even die. And the youngster was already severely infected. Of course, treatment for this would not come cheap, so in order to pay, she started selling more dresses with Gabby, and her boyfriend Laurenti was sure to help as well, with his concert tour starting soon in early 1922. However, incredibly, shortly after arriving in upstate New York for said concert tour, he caught a cold, developed an abscess in one of his ears, contracted spinal meningitis, and died a day after admittance to the hospital on the 7th of March, 1922. Schiaparelli was completely crushed. After Pino, who was the boy from Naples with the tuberoses, this was the second love of her life that was ripped from her prematurely. And it was she that was forced to make all of the funeral arrangements for him after his wife refused.
Wow.
By that summer, Scap had nothing. No money, no secure place to live, no job, no partner, no plan, and a daughter that needed specialized care. She was a young woman alone in a foreign country with nothing, but she always found a way to pay for her daughter's medical care. Unfortunately for her daughter, it's for all of these reasons that she is sparingly mentioned in her autobiography. It's very clear that she loved her daughter immensely, but over the next 10 years, the girl would be in and out of physical therapy and operation rooms in order for her to get use of her legs back. She went through braces, splints, casts, crutches, the possibility of an iron lung, and required extended stays in hospitals and clinics with boarding schools that were near said hospitals and clinics. She recorded later in life that she barely saw her mother and that she felt alone and parentless in this time, and would even claim that her name, which was soon to be cemented as Go-Go, came because when her mother came to see her, it was only ever brief before she claimed she had to leave, to which her daughter would reply, "Go, go." In the end, Schiaparelli's trip to America, which was supposed to be for true freedom, would end in a real long-term emotional and physical pain. For a husband that disappointed, for a love lost too soon, and for a daughter that she was simply not ready for and couldn't care for. It was time for them to leave. Unfortunately, their friend Blanche Hayes was also going through a divorce and had asked both Scap and Gabby to come with her back to the then much cheaper Paris. Scap changed Gogo's name from De Curler to Schiaparelli in the fears that he would try for custody, and the women left New York together in sadness in June 1922.
That's funny to think of Paris.
Little did they know then, Scap would soon come to owe everything she became to this trip. Quote, "I owe it to two distinct things, poverty and Paris. Poverty forced me to work, and Paris gave me a liking for it, and courage." Chapter 3. a return to Paris. Scap was returning to Paris on a Polish passport. This passport had replaced her naturalized French passport during her marriage to de Curler. However, because she and de Curler had filed for a French divorce, she would soon be neither French nor Polish, and not Italian either, since she had lost her nationality way back when she had married. And yet, extremely fortunately, when she and her friend Count Carlo Sforza, who happened to be the Italian ambassador to France, examined her passport more closely, incredibly, she discovered that she still had 2 days before it expired conclusively. As a result, immediately upon her anticipated return to Paris, she was already on the next train to Rome to secure a nationality. It wasn't ideal, but far better than being a person without access to a passport. And at least with a European passport, she could go and live in Paris in peace. This, of course, is exactly what she did. She returned once again to Paris and was invited to live with Gabby and her kids until they got settled, while their wealthier friend Blanche and her daughter Laura found themselves lodging in a hotel. It was also through Gabby that Gogo was found a doctor with whom she could live and receive the best care, namely daily electric treatments paid with the money that Scap's mother was still sending. Here, Gogo finally found the stability that her mother just couldn't offer her, and found a family that loved her dearly too. Really, it reads as if these were some of the happiest moments in the young girl's life. It's just a shame that it had to be at a distance from her mother. Eventually, Scap, who enjoyed living with another, was able to find new permanent lodgings with Blanche so they could move out of their respective hotels and moved in together to an old-fashioned apartment on the Boulevard La Tour Maubourg in the 7th arrondissement, which was a fashionable part of Paris at the time due to its proximity to the Hôtel des Invalides and the Eiffel Tower. Here, Scap hired a chef and a maid and finally seemed to have things back on track, enjoying theatres, concerts, art shows, and small dinner parties, though often on Blanche's dime. It seems she felt a bit guilty of this, to be honest, and was described as anxious to reduce her dependency on Blanche, always prompt to lend a helping hand. So, as a result, she began working for an antiques dealer, which saw her making enough to live on in a way that she could also take care of Gogo, making it seem as if she was less dependent on her mother also, though obviously I cannot confirm that, especially not considering that to help out, her mother gifted her her father's old coin collection, which she could pawn for cash. But at least it worked. All of this had been an effort to keep Gogo in treatment, help her overcome infantile paralysis. And she was clearly improving, so much so in fact that she was soon able to go out for short walks. I suppose not quite immediately, she was only 2 in 1922, but certainly soon. In the meantime, Scap, Gabby and Blanche were out meeting all the right people, including those soon-to-be collaborators like Salvador Dali and Jean Cocteau, and many future clients like Prince of Wales Edward VIII, as well as heiresses Daisy Fellows and Nancy Cunard, both of whom would go on to abandon Chanel for Scap. Furthermore, specifically, it was exactly in this summer, the summer of 1922, that Gabby would be the catalyst to Schiaparelli's interest in design after she introduced her to the work of her friend, Paul Poiret.
Oh my God.
By this point, Poiret was already on his downturn. Pre-World War I, he was...
Okay, pausing for the cause. Apologies. I just posted a video earlier today about the history of the corset that features Paul Poiret. How fitting is that? Okay, sorry, just wanted to say that. I'll back it up just a little bit, but that's just so wild that I literally was editing that video earlier today, finally finished editing it, posted it, and here we are talking about him. Wow. Okay, sorry. I'll back it up a little bit more. Not too much though. But yeah, before I get started, make sure you go and check out that video. It was really, really good about the history of corsets. And they talk about Paul Poiret being one of the few designers that went against the norm, went against corsetry and went against all that. And, just started to design much looser clothing, which is where the flapper era really got its start. We should really do a movie night on Paul Poiret because I'm sure that that's a fascinating story, because he was basically the entire reason why women stopped wearing corsets and started wearing much more looser clothes. They went to a lighter type of corset. Women still wore corsets at that time, but they were much looser. The dresses were much flowier. He did a lot more gowns. Yeah, we should definitely do a movie night on Paul Poiret. But sorry, just wanted to pause that because that was just so coincidental. All right, sorry. Okay, here we go.
Storm after he liberated women from the corset. However, post the war,
Oh, wait, sorry.
the fact that she was soon able to go out for short walks. I suppose not quite immediately, she was only 2 in 1922, but certainly soon. In the meantime, Scap, Gabby, and Blanche were out meeting all the right people, including those soon-to-be collaborators like Salvador Dali and Jean Cocteau, and many future clients like Prince of Wales Edward VIII, as well as heiresses Daisy Fellows and Nancy Cunard, both of whom would go on to abandon Chanel for Scap. Furthermore, specifically, it was exactly in this summer, the summer of 1922, that Gabby would be the catalyst to Schiaparelli's interest in design after she introduced her to the work of her friend Paul Poiret.
Okay, I know, I'm sorry. I just paused that at the same exact moment. But I did want to make mention of that. Sorry, I don't want to chew all in your face, but you have to remember that Chanel and Schiaparelli were pretty much competing with each other at the same time. And some people went with Schiaparelli, some people went with Chanel. And I think that it touched a little bit on the movie night that we did about Coco Chanel. You'll definitely have to go back and check that out. But I think it did make a really brief mention about it. So yeah, you have to keep in mind when we're talking about the history of fashion that Schiaparelli and Chanel, both in Paris, were basically competing for the same clients at the same time. So, probably not the easiest to get clients. I guess it just kind of depends on their style of which way they want it to go. But all right, no more pausing for now. Okay, here we go. Paul Poiret.
By this point, Poiret was already on his downturn. Pre-World War I, he was the designer to be seen in. His theatrical designs and vivid colors took the world by storm after he liberated women from the corset. However, post the war, he was really unable to keep up with the times and was already on the brink of bankruptcy, something that was absolutely not helped by his exuberant spending and inability to notice, firstly, the changing fashion, namely the new trend of women taking up sports, and secondly, the changing state of employment or finances,
We should do a
namely
movie
the
night on
increased
him.
labor costs following the war due to the strikes and the higher wage demands, to which he and many other manufacturers did not raise their prices to accommodate. As such, new designers Patou and Chanel, who successfully had sporty, minimal designs and as such lower costs, dominated. Simply, Poiret just couldn't keep up. But as it was, Poiret happened to be friends with Gabby's ex-husband, hence why she was eager to introduce Scap to his work. So, when he needed a hostess for whatever event he was putting on, he would just hire Gabby. It's just that Gabby, as hungry for money as Scap was, didn't have anything to wear for such a job, save for one evening dress made for her all the way back before the war. So she turned to Schiaparelli. Full of ideas and having excitedly offered to make the dress, she cut and she sewed, draping her design on her friend until coming up with a piece that, when worn, received the compliments of Poiret himself. She was ecstatic and began creating design after design, finally honing her sewing skills that were still seriously lacking at this time. She would even later go on to say that she knew nothing of dressmaking and she never drew nor designed in her life, And she was right on this. These were not her talents. But what she did know, she knew by instinct. And that was fashion in its purest sense. She had the rare ability, perhaps through naivety, to turn even the most messed up designs into something desirable to wear. A trick proven when even the slightly snobby Blanche happily received a Schiaparelli coat that had such an atrociously miscut neckline that it was unwearable. But when covered in a long-haired grey fur shawl collar, looked marvellous. To quote Seacrest, the first Schiaparelli designs were consistent with everything she would invent in years to come. That is to say, no matter how bizarre the impulse, the result was always wearable. Who cared how well a garment was constructed? The effect from a distance was what counted. Soon, Scap was making clothes for all of her friends, and with their compliments tried even to get some kind of work with her sketches, including once famously to Maggie Ruff, who told her she would do better to plant potatoes. In the meantime, she found other kinds of work in fashion, namely helping a wealthy friend of Blanche go on a shopping spree in Paris, of course, including Poiret. Poiret was now luckily on a financial uptick after he had opened a nightclub so successfully that it allowed him to reopen his couture house properly on La Rue Saint-Honoré following the war, and even in 1925, despite dwindling sales, meant that he could afford to be one of the first to move to a new sprawling place on Le Rond-Point des Champs-Élysées. But for now, it was here during this shopping trip at one of Poiret's first post-war showings that Scap would try on a particularly irresistible Poiret coat, made of upholstery velvet in vivid stripes and lines with blue crepe de chine. She looked handsome, she looked smart. She was a walking work of art. How she loved her coat of many colours. But she couldn't afford it. Poiret, having remembered her as the creator of Gabby's dress, introduced herself to a young Schiaparelli and offered it to her wholesale. Still a no. Fine, he would simply gift it to her free of charge. She simply looked too good in the coat not to do so. She goes on to say in her autobiography, "Soon I had a whole wardrobe, for he kept on giving me wonderful clothes." So yes, soon she had a master collection that made her feel beautiful, even more so than the sister with whom she was constantly compared. And that was it. Schiaparelli was completely in love with fashion. The thing is, she also respected Poiret so much. Being appreciated by him made her feel more special than even the gift itself. He had remembered her, and she loved him for it. Later in her career, she would be regularly compared to Poiret, including in Harper's Bazaar in 1934, who described her as the feminine Paul Poiret, a quip that she absolutely adored. Yes, it was he that convinced her to begin making clothes, but it was she who would take great lengths, as you will soon find out, to never, ever forget this generosity. So that was it. She would become a designer. But what would be her first commercial design? What was good enough to be her debut garment? She knew she didn't want to make a dress, for that was passé, and she also knew she hated the fashionable sports clothes available on the market. Chanel in particular was almost mass-producing garments, not literally, but she was using a lot of machine work, especially in her knits, and Schiaparelli just didn't like that. It didn't feel authentic to her. For her brand, she wanted authenticity for the true first Schiaparelli piece. So she decided on knits. That is what she would be known for. That is the most authentic Schiaparelli garment she could make. Many sources claim that this was her first jumper, the trompe-l'oeil bow jumper. This is in fact not true. The jumper she created first was actually a simple black and white speckled effect knit. When she appeared in it, it is true that the color combination was hailed by her friends and acquaintances as a happy novelty in sportswear, but it was not the infamous bow sweater. Even if you read between the lines in Scap's autobiography, she talks as if a good time has passed between her arrival in Paris and the designing of that famous sweater. She talks of thinking of inventing dresses multiple times, of finally reaching a turning point and interpreting her dress ideas into making it, but she never outright says the trompe-l'oeil sweater was her first,
Oh.
because it wasn't. In fact, by that point, as you will soon hear, she had already gone through 2 different investors, both of whom we know the names of. The truth is, her first garments under the Schiaparelli brand were made solely for her and some for her friends from her dissatisfaction with what was on offer in the market at that time, including her first serious piece, that speckle jumper, in the new year of 1924, 3 years before the trompe-l'oeil jumper. She had a long way to go yet, but she was excited, and she knew she was just getting started. Chapter 4. The True Beginnings of Schiaparelli. The immediate success of Schiaparelli as a company is often described as an accident. Even Schiap herself has said it. But this is far from the truth. In fact, despite what she may have thought or felt, there were a lot of factors that caused Schiaparelli to become the overnight success that it was. Namely, history, her lineage, and her connections. Let's first discuss history, because between 1860 and 1930 came the first generation of couturiers. Today, we think of them as great innovators in the highest esteem, but this completely contrasts how they were accepted in society at that time. Then, couturiers were seen by the beau monde as merely tradespeople, fancy or expensive even dressmakers, and as such, it was not seen as a profession respectable enough to spend social time with the elites. They provided a service, and the wealthy merely paid for said services. This included people even prior to the first generation, like Rose Bertin, the first celebrated fashion designer, through Charles Frederick Worth, who was truly the first couturier, beginning the whole concept only 2 years after opening his first shop in Paris, all the way up to Paul Poiret, who we know influenced Schiaparelli in the years just before 1930. Now, all of these names are hailed as innovators, geniuses of their time. But then, they fundamentally were not. In fact, it wasn't until Chanel, who was friends with the Duke of Westminster, that there was even a change to this perception. She was the first couturier to ever mingle with the elite ever, and even though she wasn't really a firm fixture of those circles until much later, by 1925, she had at least cracked open the door. So, from history, the thing to know about Schiaparelli's debut was that the door to the elite world had already been held ajar. But it was her lineage that saw that she was able to step through the door seamlessly. As we discussed, Schiaparelli grew up in extremely elite circles in Rome already. This would have helped her sidestep the door that Chanel had cracked open. However, so too would her marriage to De Curler, as the betrothal had made her, in name at least, a countess. She may have been breadline poor and now divorced since it finalized on the 21st of March 1924, but she had had a title and an esteemed family lineage, and that carried weight. Where Chanel had struggled to get in because she wasn't the offspring of powerful people, Schiaparelli was. So really, instead of opening the door to get inside the circles, she was already there. It was a barrier already stepped over. By lineage alone, there was credibility in whatever work she put out, and meant that there was no risk to invest, to buy, or to promote for early adopters. Though, make no mistake, if it wasn't for Chanel, this would have been a difficult barrier to overcome nonetheless. Lastly, and perhaps most obviously, it was the connections that her title and lineage afforded her that would grant her immediate entrance to backers. Where countless couturiers have had to spend years to become noticed in the hopes of getting a backer, Blanche already knew the perfect person and was willing to make an introduction. By late 1925, still with no formal training, no sewing ability, and only 2 years after making her first serious piece, she was introduced to a very wealthy American friend who was already looking to invest in a French business, named Mrs. Hartley. She invested almost immediately and bought Schiaparelli a tiny dress house named Maison Lamballe in a prime location not far from Place Vendôme. which interestingly was a location chosen via exactly what she had learned from her ex-husband de Curler. Get somewhere, anywhere with a good address, and people will believe that you are good. The Maison was established on the corner of Rue Saint-Honoré and Rue de 29 Juillet. And of course, in the end, he had begun. Schiaparelli had the legacy, the credibility, and now the money that would ordinarily have taken years for any normal couturier to earn. And so her success was immediate. By January 1926, WWD had devoted a whole article to Maison Lamballe's sport modes and daytime ensembles. Quote, "The collection, although not large, is carefully conceived and executed. Each mode maintains an individuality and reveals interest. They are all simple and direct, with very fine detail work and pleasing color combinations." Visitor interest reflected this as well, and Schiap, within only a year of opening, was already outgrowing her space. She knew that she needed somewhere bigger if she was to continue, but smartly, Mrs. Hartley knew that if she wanted to do this without going bankrupt somewhere down the line, it was time to look for a bigger sponsor, and advised Schiap to actually shut down Maison Lamballe to look for a more capable backer. Of course, the offers flooded in. It was a surefire success for all of the reasons I've just said, but the one that stood out to Schiap was Monsieur Kahn. Kahn was a successful French businessman already as a large shareholder of Galeries Lafayette and having been one of the backers to the esteemed Madeleine Vionnet, who I have a video on. It was he who financed her first real collection, which she would make out of her new lodgings at 20 Rue de l'Université come January 1927. I won't go into all of her design work as I do have a separate video on her business, but suffice to say, her first collection, which was named Display Number 1, was designed as spectator sportswear and was wildly successful critically for the countless revolutions made in handiwork, materials, colors, designs, and accessories. It was bright and bold clothing, which was a complete antithesis to Patou and Chanel, who chose dull pastels, beiges, and navies. Unfortunately, however, this did not really translate into sales. Commercially, the collection was only mildly successful and was a noticeable dip from her first foray in Maison Lamballe. Nothing to be sniffed at for sure, especially thanks to her hand-knit sweaters, which were genuinely successful and had now come to be somewhat of a signature, but it was clear that they had a disconnect. If the critics loved it and no one was buying, at least the problem was obvious. It was the location. Don't get me wrong. Schiap loved 20 la Rue de l'Université as a home. She really got on with her landlord, who would regularly bring her fine wine, or because he was an expert chef, some beautifully made dishes. It's just that, as a location for a fashionable new couturier, it left much to be desired. It wasn't in line with the lesson that she had learned from de Curler. But the problem with that was, without sales, she definitely couldn't afford to move anywhere, let alone to somewhere with a more desirable address. As a result, in order to make sales, Schiap was forced to go round to hotel suites with suitcases of jumpers to try to sell them to holidayers. It's unclear how much of a success this was, but that almost didn't matter actually, as it wasn't too long before her efforts and her provenance were rewarded. By only the following month, in February 1927, French Vogue devoted a page of photographs taken by the famed Hoignan Huenet to her designs, and only 6 months later, a full page of sketches. It was all she needed to make the customers come to her new, undesirable address. And they did. In droves. By that April, now on the hunt for new ideas for her newly flourishing namesake, she finally sees the woman to whom she credits the beginnings of the trompe-l'oeil jumper. I mentioned briefly earlier that the trend championed by Chanel at this time was machine knit knits. They were plain, they were characterless, and they were highly standardized. So, when she saw a smart American woman, who Schiap describes as a friend in her autobiography, wearing a lumpy, steady jumper, she was immediately interested. It was thick to the point that it did not stretch much and could not lose its shape like a regular knit would. This was a result of the manner in which it was knit. It was done with regular knitting needles yielded by hand, but instead of intertwining the two yarns with every stitch, it employed the second yarn in an interchangeable manner, catching the second color every fourth stitch. Today we know this as a double stitch, and it gave the kind of backing to the knit, which in turn gave it its more sturdy appearance. Scap was enthralled. She asked the American lady who had made it, and to her surprise had found it was made by an Armenian woman living in Paris without any common languages to Scap. Her name was Arusiag Michaelian, and through a friend she was able to communicate things like how the stitch was done, its limitations, and even what she wanted to see. As she discussed the Armenian stitch with the two women, Scap had a brainwave. If they could knit two contrasting colors together instead of two of the same tone, and they were to do it strategically, they may be able to knit a design. In short, they may be able to knit trompe-l'oeil. In 2 minutes, Elsa sketched a large butterfly bow to look like a scarf tied around the neck and asked for it to be white on a black background. They gave it a go, and voila! It was terrible. In the end, it took 3 samples to get it right, but eventually Scap was so excited to show off her new invention. The thing is, Scap had gone the complete opposite direction to everything that was on the market at the moment, namely Patou and Chanel, not only in construction, but also in design. And it's this that caused the knit to be a sensation immediately on debut. Literally by her first outing in the jumper, Mame Bocker of French Vogue had it drawn for French Vogue. A first order came from Anita Loos, the author of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and she had an order for 40 jumpers and 40 skirts from an American store named Abraham & Straus. You see, what Scap had done was invent a whole new genre for herself. She wasn't sporty casual like Chanel, and she wasn't dressy formal like Poiret. She was slap bang in the middle, something one could genuinely wear on all occasions. To say she was a sensation would be an understatement. Her success was instantaneous, and by the end of the year alone, Schiaparelli was one of the biggest up-and-coming names in Paris. At this same time, Gogo had been sent off to Lausanne, Switzerland, where she went to a school named L'École Bête. It was situated next to the leading authority of infantile paralysis, for which she still suffered, and could genuinely provide her the many operations that she needed. Schiaparelli very much did not want to leave her here alone and was deeply upset for being away, but she understood that it was a necessity if she wanted Gogo to recover. Gogo, on the other hand, did not understand this, and it grew into a lasting resentment of her mother because she didn't even bother to drop off her daughter personally. She recalled, "When I was first sent off to my Swiss school, Mummy's chauffeur Pierre put me on the train in Paris with a name tag around my neck. I got off in Lausanne, sat on my suitcase and waited. After a while, the station master called the school and they sent a frightening woman with a cleft palate to fetch me. She informed me that I was 2 weeks early and would have to spend my days sorting linens with her and sleep alone in the dormitory at night. Mother had obviously confused the date." Either way, it does seem that she had a good time here in the end, and she was allowed in the summers to visit her mother in Paris. It's hard to tell exactly when these summer visits began, or even when she was sent to the school in the first place, to be honest, but potentially it was in the summer of 1927 that Gogo made the first of many trips to Paris. The only thing was that she hated her mother's work. From her perspective, it was her work that was keeping the two of them apart, and it was true that because of the fashion seasons, soon all of Scap's busiest periods would coincide with Gogo's school holidays, meaning that more often than not, she was bundled off to spend holidays with Prince Lobkowitz in Kitzbühel instead. Of course, Scap needed to work in order to pay for the treatment, but obviously as a child of 7 or 8 plus, that's really hard to comprehend. Meanwhile, at this time in her business, things continued to go exceptionally well. By the January of 1928, she was already sufficiently successful to ask Monsieur Kahn for a dedicated studio, which he provided on 4 Rue de la Paix. By February 1928, Schiaparelli produced her first advert for French Vogue, quote, a quarter page in the form of a simple black block with white lettering, Schiaparelli Suéter de sport, on a white background. In the same month, the New York Sun listed her wares as now showing items other than sweaters, frocks, bathing suits, shantung seaside pajamas, and tailored jackets featuring geometric and futuristic patterns, some suggesting an insert belt or collar. Even the lofty New Yorker took it upon themselves to announce her second collection, named Display Number 2, that was coming soon. In fact, she and her trompe-l'oeil designs were so extremely in demand by this time that from this point onwards, she was able to demand prices like no other. Despite the endless and much cheaper copycats of her designs that were already flooding the market, quote, Best & Co. of New York advertised a copy of a Schiaparelli jacket suit in tweed for $79.50. Within a few months, they could not get enough of it, while a Chanel suit sold for $65. It was really remarkable at the time, not only because she was the designer selling out endlessly within a year of relaunch, but because there were so many fakes and she just didn't seem to care. While so many other designers, especially V&A, fought tooth and nail for their intellectual property, Schiap saw it as a positive, claiming that it's only when they stop copying you that you have to worry. Furthermore, it was widely known that her stance on all of this was not due to laziness. She was famous for rising at 8 a.m. daily, regardless of any condition, getting ready and going to work, looking impeccable in the process. Her motto, always on time, 5 minutes early, seemed to follow wherever she went. She opened every letter, signed every check, spoke personally on every matter with suppliers and businessmen. She styled the mannequins personally, and even when away on business, she called every single day to analyze who had come in and what they were interested in buying. She understood retailing and branding instinctively before any of it was studied. She considered house codes openly, firstly with her house color, which was initially ice blue in 1932, before turning it into any startling colors, and eventually landing on shocking pink in 1936. But this was also true, especially when it came to the design and branding for her first perfume in 1928. Then named S, but soon named Schiap, she understood that the perfume was her cash cow and the knit was her hero product, offering something customers could come back to time and time again. Yes, Schiaparelli had a head start, but she worked exceptionally hard and was thus rewarded for her effort. Of course, with this success, she was also able to extend her joy to her home life. She finally had a little money of her own, so realizing that she enjoyed the company of living with somebody else, she moved into a house on Boulevard Saint-Germain with her friend named Countess Gab, and relished in decorating the place as truly her own, very colorful home. The women each had one of 2 apartments in the residence, and they communicated via telephone before visiting the other. Thus, they both protected their friendship and at the same time were not alone. Fortunately, too, her ex-husband de Curler had recently died following a bar brawl in which he was shot in the stomach, meaning that Schiap no longer had to worry about custody for their daughter Gogo, who was now finally seeing a real improvement on her health, evolving her education in sports, learning to ski and to ride horses in Lausanne, which I'm sure for any child that could barely walk for as long as she could remember must have been euphoric. Finally, by 1929, everything was going well in Schiaparelli's life, and it was now time to design her first major collection. It's just that, unfortunately for Schiap, this bout of luck she seemed to be having was not bound to last. Chapter 5. Success upon success upon success. Though this was likely the most exciting time in her recent life, the designing of her first collection would coincide with a horrendous downturn in Gogo's health. Her appendix had burst miles away, and a dangerous infection had already set in. It was potentially fatal. At the request of her school in Switzerland, she jumped on the train from Paris to Switzerland, gave permission for her daughter to undergo the necessary surgery, and through necessity, but also to pass the time, began designing her first major collection on the train. Little is known about the surgery itself, or in fact what happened in Switzerland, but in no doubt the surgery was a success, and Elsa returned to designing the rest of the collection on the return journey, while Gogo, of course, returned to her schooling. The collection was informed by changing fashion trends of the day, but not sportswear. Schiap had gotten this far on sportswear, and she knew it could tide her over. But by 1929, sports clothes were already falling out of favor because the designs were formulaic and unimaginative. As a result, Schiap began trying out a new slogan. Instead of pour le sport, she designed pour la vie, pour le soir, a slogan that later, in 1932, would go under her name on her store. As it was, because of this decision, the collection was a major success. Schiap's debut was the talk of the town, and she was secured on top of the fashionable world. But within only a breath of this feat came the Great Depression. Nearly all the couturiers in Paris were at risk. Foreign clients were staunchly buying from their own countries, there was less money in general, and millions of francs were being poured in to desperately save the haute couture. But Schiap had one thing that her competitors simply didn't: experience in America. Quickly, she annexed all of her customers in London and Paris, monopolized the export market, and targeted the middle class as well as the upper. She planned early and decisively for the Depression, and she, more than anyone else, was about to see her company not only survive, but thrive. Schiaparelli almost immediately came out on top of the economic crash, with the rich and famous coming to her primarily as the only person able to bring sunshine in such a bleak time. By 1929, she was already so successful, in fact, that she bought out Monsieur Kahn to become the sole owner of her company, and in the blink of an eye, cut him out for better backing from the French banking branch of the Rothschilds. Though, with that said, she from this moment on remained the sole owner of her company, a real anomaly in haute couture even to this day. She was undoubtedly a fantastic businesswoman. But, like her mentor Paul Poiret, she was awful with money. If it hadn't been for Monsieur Meunier, who was her in-house accountant, her frivolous spending would have put the business in trouble quickly. But as it was really her personality that saved her. Meunier was unwaveringly loyal to Schiap, and despite how she expressed her frustrations when things went wrong, sometimes even firing people if they told her one of her ideas was impossible, he was good to Schiap and steered her finances into a profitable place, even if that meant allowing her to do some rather unnecessary purchases lumped in with what they actually needed. In fact, most of Schiap's staff were loyal to her. She was an exceptionally kind boss. She sold her work to her employees for less than the cost of embroidery alone, paid very good wages even during the Depression, gave them 3 weeks paid holiday leave before any was required by law, permanently kept 2 beds at the St. Joseph Hospital for anyone that might fall ill, including for former employees, sent gifts to them also, including former employees, helped them raise their children, was truly kind and nurturing to their talents, and had a bond with her collaborators and her employees that saw that most were at least fiercely loyal, if not, like the famous Jean Clement, who created accessories out of plastics, exclusive to Schiaparelli, which in his case meant he was actively turning down work from people like Balenciaga and Chanel until much, much later. It really was considered a privilege to work for the Schiaparelli house, so people rarely left. When she asked them for overtime, or it was required without asking, it was seen as fair and understandable, so they just didn't mind giving back to the woman that had given them so much. She was loyal to them, and even through the tough times soon to come, they remained loyal to her. This also extended to her housing staff, the quantity of which would soon increase rather exponentially after she moved to the Boulevard Saint-Germain in 1931. Here, she would have a whole host of home staff, including the chef and multiple maids as she had before, who mostly just seemed to help her with time, as all evidence actually points to the fact that she was a particularly good cook and an even better host. Yes, to her famous guests, but she was also very, very good to her staff. As in trade-off for cleaning up, she would do all of the preparations for her many parties, including cooking for the tens of guests that would arrive, giving her staff the night off.
Wow.
Meanwhile, publicly, Schiaparelli had become a true celebrity in herself. She was photographed on the streets, she was seen at all of the top events of the social season, and was even offered to be paid for her endorsement of products. Things like walking down the street with a diamond shoe buckle on, or in another advert, she would walk across town with a diamond-studded leash across a lion. The days when couturiers could not rub shoulders with their clients was certainly forgotten, and soon everyone wanted to know her and desperately wished for an invite to one of her infamous parties. Property-wise, soon Schiap expanded her portfolio of homes with a small cottage in the forest of Ermenonville near Paris that once belonged to the gardener of La Rochefoucauld, where the writer and philosopher Rousseau had once lived. Also, her business by 1933 just couldn't stop expanding, with one major expansion on the horizon. An expansion that, once again, came from the people that she had met. Specifically, she had met and become romantically involved with two brothers. The first, named James Allen Horn, always known as Alan, and was the oldest of 5 brothers, which made him almost a whole generation older than Schiaparelli, and Henry Spence Horn, who I believe was the youngest, as he was a generation younger than Alan at 44 years old, so only 1 year older than Schiaparelli was. The brothers could not have been more different. Alan had made a ton of money in India and had invested it in a lovely, narrow, 4-story townhouse at 6 Upper Grosvenor Street. Meanwhile, Henry, their mother's favourite, was spoiled and lived on a very grand scale, but was more freewheeling and dealing than his brother, and was always looking for a new business, of which he had multiple successes. Actually, the FBI later described him as professionally charming, especially to wealthy ladies. So even though he was a bit more wheeling and dealing, it wasn't necessarily always seen as a good thing. Exactly when the brothers met Schiaparelli is unclear. What is also unclear is how they both simultaneously began a relationship with her, especially without a single recorded fight. Either way, it went on long enough that Gogo felt that one of them, we assume Henry, was the closest thing to a father she had ever had. This proves to be somewhat of an anomaly for Schiap's private life. You see, Schiap claims to have been so emotionally damaged from De Curler, who, by the way, had now passed away from a bar fight in 1928 in which he was shot in the stomach, that she didn't believe in long-term relationships anymore. So she claimed the whole affairs were both more casual than most, usually revolving just around holidays or enjoying each other's company. But clearly from Gogo's recollection, they were in a very long-term relationship and had caring elements to it. Perhaps in hindsight, it's just that she didn't want to accept it or acknowledge the relationship as genuine, lest she be hurt again. Either way, really the most important thing to note is that the two very handsome, apparently, men were cataclysmic to her finding footing in London. Specifically, it was Alan's home at 6 Upper Grosvenor Street, which had been empty due to the Depression, that Alan, through much convincing by Henry, allowed Schiap to use as a commercial space. As such, she took to living in London for a spell in the top 2 rooms above the space while she opened the shop, and later, when business had proved to be financially successful, she managed to get herself a small mews nearby that she could reside in when in town, either on business or to visit the brothers. As a result, her business boomed and became bigger than ever, with her 400 employees by 1934 making between 7,000 and 8,000 garments a year. This majorly secured profits, both from the high production cost, by the sheer amount of clients despite lower costs afforded to a smaller couture house, which hers still technically was, and the fact that Schiap, more than most, was very willing to work with American manufacturers, either using their fabrics as promotion for them or for licensed products like shoes and hosiery, all of which opened up the American market more to the designer. But while things were going swimmingly for Schiaparelli, things were not going well for most. Amongst the struggling couture houses was her friend Paul Poiret. By 1934, Poiret was living on charity at 10 francs a day. Schiap literally never forgot his generosity and actively campaigned for him when the Chambre syndicale de couture Parisian moved to vote him to a monthly pension. Unfortunately, she was not successful because of remarks Poiret had made about Charles Frederick Worth, so instead she bought paintings of his at an exhibition and helped him to recede from the public spotlight. She never let him go, and she would invite herself to dinners often, always wearing one of his designs when he took her to restaurants in Le Halles, a place she knew he received free meals. He grew up there and the local owners were kind to anyone that was down on their luck. She knew this well, in fact, but never made it a qualm, nor did she ever comment about it. Perhaps it's for her kindness that when it was time for him to sell his illustrious place at the Rond-Point des Champs-Élysées, he initially offered it to her. As it was, she turned him down. It just wasn't a good location to cater to the flaneurs or walk-ins because it was simply too busy of a junction, but also because it would have opened her up to comparison to him, which is something she didn't want. Instead, the solution to her problem, that she had outgrown, 4 Rue de l'Abbaye, came in January 1935 when she found the 98-room mansion at 21 Place Vendôme. This she inherited from the couturier named Madame Louise Chery, who 40 years before had helped launch the career of the then teenage Paul Poiret, which unfortunately is the thing that she's best known for today, despite being one of the first women ever to own a couture house, something she did exceptionally successfully.
Wow.
The place was absolutely massive, and now it was up to Schiaparelli to fill it. Of course, there was space for fittings and for her seamstresses and tailors, but most notably, this gave her the space to open Couture's first ready-to-wear boutique on the ground floor. Though then it was known as a boutique, which was a 13th century word that described the part of a facade of a house where a merchant or craftsman displayed and sold their wares. The shop was an absolute sensation. The store, which was named Schiap, sold knits, lingerie, swimsuits, dressing gowns, hats, belts, scarves, handbags, and jewelry, basically anything that needed no ongoing alterations, displayed with imagination and whimsy on straw figures. The windows allowed for customers to peer in. The winding staircase and the accompanying elevator to the maison allowed a division between the two worlds and an opportunity to upsell as the stairs were in the back. And it meant that they could sell works to even those that may not have been able to afford a dress, bringing back that idea of selling simultaneously to the mid and high classes that saw her thrive during the Depression. All now done with the new slogan, handmade and ready to be taken away immediately, even with minor alterations. Truly, it was a phenomenon. Tourists flocked to Schiap. Her London residents were seeing more business than ever because of it, and because Schiap herself was a bona fide celebrity by this point, people were genuinely following her advice, even if they couldn't afford a Schiap dress for themselves. A wonderful example of this is from the 21st of May, 1935, from the Daily Express, where she penned an open letter to her daughter, who was now somewhat unhappily residing in a boarding school named Abbots Hill School in Hemel Hempstead, not too far from London. I'm going to read the whole thing just in case you're listening. Dear Gogo, soon now you will be buying your own clothes. So, considering the time I spent worrying about clothes for women, some of whom I have never even seen, I suppose I ought to give you a little advice. To begin with, you won't have a big dress allowance because I think it's a bad thing for young people, maybe for all women, I'm not sure. It takes them longer to acquire judgment if their mistakes cost them nothing. Up till now, you have been wearing tailor-mades most of the time. Well, this is not a bad habit for anyone. Don't allow yourself to react from it too violently. Your first inclination will surely be to buy as much as you can for your money. Don't give in to it. You can only get to know good clothes from bad by looking at good ones. So, when you see a smart woman, study her. Only the rich can afford cheap clothes. If something you see looks worth twice its price, you may be sure the illusion will not last. What you buy must be good. Cut is of first importance, and cut, of course, implies fit. Suits, coats, dresses cut by an expert, fitting you perfectly, will stay smart long after the fashions which they follow is forgotten. I will not give you a list of colors which will go and those which will not, because I believe that any one color will look well with any other provided, and this is, I think, the secret, that both are good, clear, clean colors. Schiaparelli's fame and adoration meant now that she could be truly free with her designs, collaborations included, which, because of her great social skills, remain one of the oldest examples we have today of ongoing collaborations being financially and emotionally successful for everyone involved. Whether it was Arusiag Michaelian still doing the knits and in fact now with a workshop of her own, Léonore Fini on the design of her perfume bottles, Jean Cocteau on the embroidery and buttons, or Salvador Dali on prints. This influence also carried over to clients as she was now selling outfits as a whole instead of piece by piece, which is far more common even today. But of course, this freedom is most seen in her own design work. She now had invented the idea of themed collections, most famous of which were her circus-themed collection and her zipper collection, that still makes people think that she invented the couture zipper, which she did not. It seems V&A did, and Elsa merely made the zipper a focal point and a design element. Nevertheless, her designs were practical. They had large pockets, suit separates, and comfortable culottes for biking, all of which, now that she had effectively, accidentally probably, invented fashion obsolescence with her themed collection, were more fashionable and more desirable than ever. Money circulated like rainwater, and nothing could bring her down. But something could bring her further up. In 1937, she discovered a new place to live for herself, and for Gogo too, if she was ever in town. An 18-room mansion at 20 Rue de Berry, right near the Champs-Élysées. The home became one of Scap's great loves. She filled it like a treasure trove of things found on her travels, and it was more of a hit than ever for her famous parties. She carried over all of her staff to the new lodgings, and it became somewhat of a hangout for the rich and famous. This, of course, included her infamously horrendous hosting debut, in which her upholstery melted itself onto Coco Chanel's outfit, to her horror but to Scap's amusement. Soon, her parties became again that of legend. One would give a coin to Mr. and Mrs. Satan on their way in, hoping to get a return invitation from the large statues that Scap had found in a Scottish vintage store. Then they'd come inside for some good Scap-cooked food and some Scap-prepared drinks before they all dived through her clothes and costumes to put on shows and skits for one another. They always had a gay time, and the creme de la creme was desperate to be invited. As for Gogo, now 16, she actually was coming to London often. She described Abbott's as medieval, and so Scap had taken it upon herself to make weekends more fun with trips out on Sundays with her school friends where she would buy them beer, which I probably should explain is legal in England at 16 to have beer or wine with a meal when at dinner in pubs or restaurants. Though if you'd like to be shocked, the at-home age is actually 5 years old for drinking. Wow. What's more important, however, was how Gogo appeared. Considering she had been through endless treatments for infantile paralysis, and she had been a bit chubby in childhood, not that Scap said anything, nor that Scap cared, what came as a shock was that she had become absolutely tiny, practically hipless. She'd also become fluent in Italian, English, and French, and was currently studying German. Wow. Effectively, she was now beautiful, intelligent, and as the daughter of Schiaparelli, had become accidentally famous. Of course, this happened over a period of time, from about when she was 16/17 in 1937 and leaving Abbot Hill, through another school in Paris, a winter in Munich, and a cooking course from a Russian chef, all culminating into actual genuine fame when she returned to live in London with her mother, I'm assuming in 1938, 1939. It doesn't really seem that she liked fame all that well, however, and she continually struggled to distinguish herself from her mother's shadow. Though this certainly was not helped by the matching outfits she was forced to wear, or the soon-to-be-released line of younger fashion, which acted as a diffusion line to Schiaparelli, but was called Gogo. With all of that said, things did change when she could be left alone without a chaperone. She began frequenting parties, smoking and drinking with other elite children, and considering her mother was always away with Henry Horn on some far-flung holiday-cum-business trip, she seemed to take care of herself rather well. But really, in that sense, she had become quite like her mother, who too was still frequenting and throwing regular parties, the most famous of which at the very tail end of 1939, in which she was partying with Coco Chanel in Bal de la Farette in a costume ball, when Chanel, who had come dressed as herself, steered Scap, who was dressed as a surrealist oak tree, into lit candles, purposely catching her competitor on fire. Obviously, this story is regularly told to show how much of a shrill, awful woman that Chanel was, which is undeniably true. But Scap really never seemed to mind. She was put out by guests using soda siphons and just continued to openly champion the successes of other professional career women like nothing happened. In consequence, even then, Chanel came out worse in the social circles, and she wasn't widely liked either before or after this incident. But soon, this social distance between the two was to worsen quite significantly, as within just months of that party that divided them by fire, over the horizon came World War II. Chapter 6. World War II. Since 1922, when Mussolini came into power in Italy, Scap had gone to lengths to express her disdain for him. This, of course, predates the formal start of her business by about 3 years, but she never once stopped talking about it to friends or even in the press. She was openly politically active in the public, and that, even at the very beginning of the Second World War, meant that she was considered a member of the Solidarité Internationale Antifasciste. This openness was about to help her exponentially during the war. But the freedom that this initially allowed did not last for long. At the very outbreak of war, on the 1st of September 1939, when Hitler bombed Poland and both France and England joined the war, Scap closed her London branch, saying, "My London years had been the happiest of my life." In France, the fear of war set in fast, and one of the first streets to be notably affected was Rue de Berry, where Scap had her mansion. This was because it was home to the Belgian embassy, who happened to be Scap's next-door neighbour. Here, the embassy was immediately struggling to find proper shelter and food for the many people that needed it, and so without them asking for aid, Scap opened her concierge's lounge as a bivouac where she and her staff served hot coffee, bread, and butter 24 hours a day.
Wow.
It wasn't long before her home had become one of the best safe houses in all of Paris.
Wow.
The bistro in which her party guests once dined on Scap-cooked food turned into a meeting place for the British officers. Volunteer American drivers could stop to recharge, and the women of the French Mechanized Transport Corps, a group that included Gogo as she was equally quick to volunteer to the war efforts, found a safe place to sleep. Her home became housing for all those that needed it, upwards of 30 at one point in literally every room in the house. But there's even more than this, because Scap was volunteering for the Salvation Army personally, who were not yet known as a controversial charity, where she effectively did the same thing as was going on in her home, just in other locations. She was also helping to lift spirits in camps and even designed a uniform for them free of charge. Meanwhile, the Couture House carried on trying to deliver that joy and whimsy that people seemed to need at this time. Even if there were less sales to be had, even if they were working half-staffed, with most of the women working in the Atelier Flou, which is drapery, having been evacuated early, and even without all of the male tailoring team entirely, they knew what they were doing was important for keeping spirits high. Though, with that said, it's also worth noting that at this point, if it wasn't for her incredible relationship with her workers, who were more than happy to work for half wages, and if it wasn't for her connection to the American market, where the sense of war hadn't yet hit, the business would have been far worse off. It's just fortunately, as she had both of those things, the company was better prepared than most for these early years. At the same time, the entire basement of Vendôme Place Vendôme was turned into a shelter for the war effort, somewhere that her staff could be protective if ever there was a sign of danger, which in fact Schiap herself was there for the first air raid, which probably came in late 1939, at which time she noticed that it worked perfectly for said protection. So, her business was well set up. Her charitable actions were also very well set up. She was designing collections either with practicality in mind, so things like large pockets, so one could stuff them full in case of an emergency, maybe in a military style as well, think like military jackets or coats, or in a practical whimsy to raise spirits, for example, using dog chains to close suits, which was practical because of the rationing of buttons and safety pins. However, one thing to know about Schiap is the one thing that she adored as much as fashion was travel. And she had absolutely no intention of stopping just because of the declaration of war. In fact, she travels to such an extent that it's genuinely confusing to keep up with if you're not actively paying attention to whichever book you're reading. She absolutely was not traveling for safety, as she regularly goes in and out of Paris through this time, but instead, she was traveling, at least at first, to help the war efforts, and then soon was just traveling mostly for pleasure and to ferry things around across the seas for those that may need it. To tell her story properly, we're going to have to come back to the travel for war efforts, but for now, in an effort to consolidate the incredible amount of travel, I've made a decision just to largely cut out the chronology of many of these places that she went in these early war years, and instead just give you a list. You see, before mid-July 1940, so we're only talking about 9 or 10 months later, she had already been from, and forgive me if I've missed somewhere, from Paris to Long Island, back to Paris to Biarritz, Spain, Portugal, across Portugal to Coimbra, then to Lisbon in the Estoril, all before taking a plane to New York, arriving on the 1st of August 1940.
Wow.
Of course, this kind of travel was impossible for most. Even for the rich and famous of the day, it was unheard of.
That's crazy.
But Elsa got around it mostly with her contacts. She was easily one of, if not the best connected person in all of Paris by this point, so her name and her face preceded her wherever she went. In short, it was her friends that granted her permission for her incessant travelling in a time when visas were near impossible to procure. But again, this would soon come back to bite her. Meanwhile, Gogo was soon bound for America as well. It's just, unlike her mother, it really wasn't for pleasure. I believe it was in early 1940 that America ordered a recall to all American citizens in France. And because Gogo had been born in America all those years before, that made her a citizen by birth, which meant that she was, amongst all the other Americans, forced to emigrate, regardless of the fact that she had absolutely no memories there. Still, without causing a fuss, she made her way to the nearest port, which happened to be in Genoa in Italy, and it was here, while waiting for her cruise liner back to New York, she met a real American named Robert L. Berenson. He was a very handsome 26-year-old representative in Europe for the shipping company Grace Lines, who she thought initially was making efforts to flirt with her friend who she was traveling with. She, of course, was wrong. He was pursuing her. Together, they had a particularly romantic shipboard romance, and upon arrival were engaged within just 2 weeks. Come the wedding, Elsa was not present, nor was she in the country, nor was she invited, nor did Gogo even wear a Schiaparelli design. In fact, really it seems that the two women were quite at odds privately by this point, even if publicly they remained cordial. Schiaparelli had released another line named Gogo, this time for junior miss departments in American department stores, something Gogo very much hated, embarrassed as it infantilized her in the public eye despite her recent marriage, and she felt exploited by her mother, especially after the junior miss line came out with a honeymoon attire set to capitalize on her wedding. Schiap too also felt awful about the situation. She felt betrayed by Gogo for purposely disallowing her to be at the wedding, something that really hurt as she felt that everything that she had done thus far was in service to her. Of course, it is understandable that she could see it this way. For many years, Schiap had paid for the best medical care that she could afford, even when she could barely afford food herself. But it is too understandable from Gogo's side. She always just wanted a mother. But even in the times that she was able to visit in the school holidays, Schiap just couldn't put her work aside to be with her. Unfortunately, as you can tell, this caused a rift that would never truly heal. By that June, the war had started to catch up with the Schiaparelli business as well. Cancellations had begun for a whole host of reasons, and because of incoming Nazi threats, she couldn't even ship out the autumn collection to America, where it had the best chance to make some money. As a result, like most of the remaining couturiers, she was forced to make the decision to lock up Van der Am Place Vendôme and follow them to Biarritz, where the couturiers thought they could safely continue business, which in Schiaparelli's case saw that about 17 staff followed. In this time, Schiap confined her perfume business to her attorneys at law and left her Rue de Berry home to the Quakers so that it could continue to aid refugees in her absence. However, almost immediately as they arrived in Biarritz on the 10th of June 1940, Mussolini aligned himself with Hitler. Schiap was mortified. Her birthplace of Italy had stabbed her chosen home of Paris in the back. She felt hopeless and fell to the floor to weep. Eventually, she picked herself up. She dusted herself off and realized that if she wanted to fight back, it was now or never. Couture historically was already used for pro-France propaganda during wars. During the French Revolution, Rose Bertin had been asked to travel back and forth to Germany to find financial help for Marie Antoinette, to whom she was so famously the patron. Then, Paul Poiret, in the First World War, had designed a collection that toured America to help improve their perceptions of the French. But now, as the most famous designer in all of Paris, it was up to Elsa Schiaparelli to convince the Americans that theirs was the side to be on. Specifically, she was asked to do a series of lectures named Clothes Make the Woman, hosted in clubs and department stores across the country. And actually, it is at this time that she made that trip that I half told you about before, from Paris to Biarritz to Spain to Portugal, across Portugal to Coimbra, then to Lisbon in the Estoril, all before taking a plane to New York, arriving on the 1st of August 1940. I only say half because from here, she then traveled endlessly around America for almost the whole year, ending in November. A trip for which she had designed a capsule wardrobe in the Rockefeller Center office for Schiaparelli Parfum upon arrival. These were meant as promotions specifically, as during her tour, replicas were planned to be sold at $1 apiece to raise funds for the Quakers and for the unemployed fashion workroom workers. However, the pieces that she designed, although designed in New York, were meant to be sent from Paris, after 5 of her staff, including the director Louis Arthur Meunier and the secretary Yvon Souquier, agreed to return to Paris to reopen the store. But after the boat carrying her garments was bombed en route, they were just eventually made in America through Bonwit Teller with their less luxurious materials. This was a bit of a disaster, but either way, they were a hit with the public nonetheless and raised a ton of money for charity. But in fact, this was not the only charitable effort that she purposefully made in this time. She organized a children's painting competition, complete with exhibitions at which the paintings were sold to benefit the Red Cross, again before they were known to be actively anti-LGBTQ. She arranged a whole philanthropic group named the American Relief to France, which was headed by former President Herbert Hoover, and she gave literally all the profits of her lecture tours to the Quakers, Red Cross, and French welfare organizations. But all of this was done before her lecture tour garments had even been sent to New York, let alone before the tour had started. And yet, things were soon to take a turn for the worse in 2 very distinct ways. Firstly, but not chronologically first, in September 1940, Japan agreed to join Germany in the war in the event that America joined, effectively making Schiap's job of convincing Americans to join all that much harder, swelling the tour dates to 42 towns in 8 weeks, though saying that the tour was extremely successful, bringing in hundreds of people at each date and popularizing a coat made in rocket red across the country. And secondly, but chronologically first, back in the August of 1940, so only a month after she arrived in America, a group of German officials visited the Chambre Syndicale to inform them that they would soon cease to exist. They had the Nazi plan to transport all of the couturiers to Berlin or Vienna, where they were expected to make only Nazi-approved designs for German women. Of course, the head of the Chambre Syndicale, Lucien Lelong, also anti-Nazi, fought them very hard on this. They didn't want to go, primarily, but secondly, he didn't believe that the Nazis understood anything about their logistics. By moving them to Berlin or Vienna, they would lose access to the embroidery, the plumery, the fabric mills, all of the different components that made their work the best in the world. Nothing compared to the French facilities, and by moving them, they would lose the quality of couture that the Nazis wanted. So it was in the Nazi best interest to keep them in Paris. With that argument, for now they acquiesced, but they still ransacked their staff nonetheless, taking anyone they could, so anyone gay, Jewish, disabled, or even the Roma and Sinti traveling community, back to Auschwitz, which had been established in May 1940, where they forced the sewers to do exactly as the Nazi wives wanted. They were to produce, I think, free couture for the Nazi wives and girlfriends in trade for better working conditions during the day. A little later, as the facility grew, Parisian couturiers would even outsource work here, as they ended up with quite a sizable facility that was useful to those that weren't completely against the Nazis. Though the book I'm referencing for this doesn't explicitly go into which Parisian couturiers used the workhouse. This, for Schiaparelli, specifically included her last remaining first tailor, whose name is very kindly not mentioned in any book. It was instructed by the Nazis to follow them, I assume to Auschwitz, where they had their facility, in their couture camp. Schiaparelli was obviously still abroad at this time, but Irene Danard, who had been trusted with running the house while she was away, took it upon herself to travel to the Nazi headquarters and fought for the man so dearly needed. She argued, equally to how Lalonde had saved the couture businesses in Paris, that they would go bust without his expertise. Schiaparelli was the preeminent designer after all, and they needed to remain open. Incredibly, she won out. She may not have known how awful the concentration camps were yet, but she literally saved this man from a concentration camp, most likely Auschwitz, and yet the war had only just begun. Chapter 7. Suspicion. Still in New York, but now finished with her tour, by December 1940, Elsa wanted nothing more than to get back to Paris. The Quakers had given her $60,000 worth of vitamins and medicine for the children in the non-occupied zone of France. Friends had given her a couple $1,000s to smuggle in. She carried cash of her own for the needy and a key for her wealthy friend's safety deposit box so that she could empty it and keep her things safe, knowing that the Nazis were going through them. She eventually arrived in Paris in January 1941 and was met at the station by her lawyer, Armand Albert Gregoire, who she was surprised to learn had defected to Nazism. Fortunately, it seems she did not tell him of her contraband, as in regards to her smuggled goods, most of the things successfully travelled without detection. In fact, save for her own money, they all successfully reached their destinations. At the same time, the Schiaparelli company had devolved into almost exclusively selling licensed products, Schiaparelli perfumes and colognes, sachets, lingerie, envelopes, even bath sponges, guest soaps, and dusting powders, making it quite clear that her ready-to-buy boutique was one of the best decisions she had ever made, especially now that the perfume was solidly propping up the business financially. But even for the few clients that did come for clothes, she was fortunately well stocked for them in fabrics as well, because of her once foolish consumption of hundreds of meters of fabric. In fact, even her home was doing okay, as it had been placed under diplomatic protection, potentially because of its status as a bivouac. So, everything material that she had was actually doing quite well in the early years of the war, it seems. It's just that, as a person, Schiaparelli was in a far less favourable situation. Though she was a naturalised French citizen once again, both the Germans and the Italians considered her Italian and as such were actively aware of her numerous public decries of Mussolini as well as her recent pro-France work in America. As such, by May 1941, just as the Nazis occupied Greece and broke apart Yugoslavia, she was tipped off by the American consul that she needed to get out of Dodge quickly. She entrusted her valuable furniture to Janssen and her jewels to Cartier, both of whom were well known on the underground to store fortunes for those that needed it. She insured her house to the Brazilian embassy, who was neutral and sure to remain as such, secured the Schiaparelli Maison to her in-house accountant Meunier, left the management of it to Irene Danard, Michel Guyon, Jean Clément, Arisek Michaelian, and Yvonne Souquier, and finally named a new general manager for Schiaparelli Parfum in Monsieur Cavalier Coll, who, because of his experience dealing with Germans before, had been sent to help through Poitou. Make no mistake, this was a terrifying time. Not only had she had to give over everything she had worked to build, but everything she personally owned of value as well, with next to no certainty that it would ever be returned. Of course, we discussed most, if not all, of the people that she had entrusted her fortune to as people that were loyal to her. But still, it couldn't have been easy to do all of this as well as prepare for leaving her beloved Paris once more. At this point, I should tell you that her travels once again get absolutely ridiculous. Too much to even list this time. But the thing to know is that her travel was becoming increasingly difficult, genuinely impossible for most, including Schiaparelli's famous peers. It was still a wonder that she was able to travel so much. But again, Schiap had contacts like no one else. It's exactly that had gotten her through the borders. It's just now, at this time, those paramount connections included Nazis. Specifically, she was on good terms with a man named Otto Abetz. He was Hitler's ambassador to France under the occupation, and his job was to recruit French Fifth columnists, which were secret Nazi sympathizers and supporters, tasked with helping them spread pro-Nazi sentiment and to surreptitiously give over secreted information. Abetz was exceptionally successful at his job and would soon grow to be one of the most powerful people in all of occupied France, if not the most powerful. Abetz, too, was not a covert friend to Schiaparelli. They were openly friendly, including during the fashion show seasons, when Abetz's wife would visit the Schiaparelli shows seated on the front row. It was here that it was widely known by early 1941 that she sat next to a Jewish woman named Elizabeth, who was the estranged wife of the Baron Philippe de Rothschild, who, after requesting to swap seats away from Abetz's wife, found herself sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp only the next day. It was here she died a mere 4 years later. This really was the beginning of Schiaparelli playing the fence. It was this that gave her the freedom to travel across the world, as she did so openly for most of the war, but it's also this that saw her home protected from being plundered, allowed her to keep an astounding 3 cars, and allowed her home and work staff to remain safe as well. It's just this level of protection was almost completely unheard of, and obviously came from her having high-powered friends on both sides. Plus, because of her frequent travels, it wasn't even a covert use of favors either, again from both sides, and it ended up being this that really catalyzed major suspicion as to her intentions. Schiap went on the defensive. She played an ambiguous role to both sides, which did nothing to help her suspicious reputation. As a result, her fashion and perfume businesses ended up being seized and were put under control of a German commissioner named Dr. Karl Klugmann, and her bank accounts were frozen. The American and French suspicions shortly followed, and her friends had already been tabbed for a covert and confidential report. Unfortunately, the report ended up concluding that those that knew Madame Schiaparelli maintained that, politically speaking, she had always been guided by feelings of snobism and opportunism and capable of feeling at ease in circles of the extreme right. The same report also spoke about her employees and how they felt abandoned when she hurriedly left for her initial American tour, which led to further questioning about her intentions, and then questions were raised about the French lawyer Armand Albert Gregoire, who had met her upon her arrival to Paris and with whom she had worked back in 1938. You see, by the time Schiap had arrived back in Paris in January 1941, he had long already been charged with espionage in April 1940, then was scooped up by the Nazis in May 1940, all before becoming the preeminent attorney in occupied France when he picked her up. They expected Schiaparelli to have known this, and so, finally, her extensive contacts, which had served her so well, were coming back to haunt her. Gossip columns began to run fake stories about her. Even old partners she had had claimed she set up specialized espionage systems within her own company, encouraged her doorman to get intelligence from chauffeurs, and even asked her models to report any conversations she heard back to Schiaparelli. Of course, these articles were all easily disproved as they contained a good amount of inaccuracies. But because of her Italian roots, the public suspicion, and frankly her fame, the report was sent to the FBI. As it was, they paid little attention to the report, and it didn't cause too much serious attention. Or at least that was until the autumn of 1941, when the German manager of her New York branch of Parfum Schiaparelli was quoted in an interview saying, "There is going to be no England when the Germans finish with it." Naturally, this set off alarm bells, and unknown to Scap, she was now the subject of a secret FBI investigation. British suspicion followed in this time as well, but this time not because of her actions, but because of both Alan and Henry Horn, the brothers that got her the 6 Upper Grosvenor Street location. Henry had been borrowing heavily, by which I assume it means embezzling, from her company against her knowledge shortly before the war, all to the extent that it caused her London business to go completely bankrupt. Henry offered to resign in 1940, and Scap ended up in a huge legal battle to regain control of her now defunct business. While Alan had inadvertently sold all of his assets, including the 6 Upper Grosvenor Street location, in the fears of a Nazi investigation, but just ended up raising suspicion of himself, and his funds were frozen. Because of this, when time came for the New York branch to pay out profits to the owners of the London branch, which had helped set up the office in New York, Scap claimed to be the sole owner and took $25,000 in cash at that time, which would be around $500,000 today. This is what raised the suspicion in the British, and so they too began their own investigation. As part of this, they stopped a Marie Parkinson, whose husband had acted as the director of Parfum Schiaparelli in Paris, but was about to take over the US operation in New York. Marie actually didn't know Schiaparelli that well, and she knew little of the business as well, but she still took it upon herself to claim that Schiaparelli was violently anti-British and accused her of being a fifth columnist, which I'll remind you were the secret Nazi sympathizers and supporters that helped them spread pro-Nazi sentiment and helped them get secreted information. Something that Marie was accusing Scap of just because she believed Scap was stirring up anti-British feeling in the French press. Stupidly, the British saw this as conclusively true, despite her very weak link to the woman, and so they colluded with the US Treasury to block all funds paid to Schiaparelli from her New York branch of Parfum Schiaparelli, citing that it should now be sent directly to the British branch where they could keep it from her, instead using it for the war efforts. Of course, the timing of this was absolutely horrendous. She had just landed once again in New York in mid-1941 for an incredibly arduous trip, and she was undergoing the work to acquire a permanent visa, which, difficult in any case, was now made significantly worse by both the British and the Americans. And yet, considering she was adamant about not starting her couture house again in New York for fear of losing credibility in the eyes of the Chambre syndicale, almost immediately, she then continued on from New York to a tour of South America. Here, she visited 8 countries over 14 stops in at least Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, and Puerto Rico, claiming that she was promoting the perfume business in all of the countries and/or to source rare oils. However, inarguably, this was the single most suspicious thing she did during the war. It was a trip that she had taken from George Parkinson, husband of Marie, the distribution manager for New York, who, when later interviewed by the FBI, still could not figure out why she went. She had adapted his original trip heavily for herself, which in his opinion meant the trip could not have been for the original purpose. Simply 14 stops in 7 weeks plus travel time is not long enough to make contacts, contracts, or meet with retail outlets. Yes, she could probably still buy the rare materials that Parkinson knew were contraband, but then why the other locations? And why in this trip include 3 separate stops in Peru? Especially considering it was one of her least successful markets and least prospective markets at that. To this day, it is still totally unexplained and remains as one of the sole reasons some still believe Schiaparelli was doing espionage work for the Vichy government. The accusations then just kept on coming throughout the war, and though Schiap was potentially unaware of the FBI investigation still, by the 15th of January 1942, well after her return from South America, they had made it very clear through a memorandum that she was under investigation. I should also point out, though, at this time, she never ever stopped her philanthropic works to aid France and the war cause. She now had a calendar to raise funds and spirits, organized an art show of Miro, Duchamp, Picasso, and more, supported by Peggy Guggenheim, and she even became an auxiliary nurse in January 1942, the same month that she discovered she was under investigation. Even by 1943, she was still heavily volunteering. This time, she was aiming to go on the North African trip, as well as to France, to serve the Allied liberation. However, while she was waiting to be deployed for this trip and staying in Washington in the meantime, often invited to the White House in fact, she was struck from the list of volunteers because they claimed that she was too old. But this is very, very unlikely to have been the reason. You see, now along with Germany, Italy, America, France, and Britain, Canada was now also suspicious of Schiaparelli and had announced her to be banned from entering the country completely. They believed that because her fortune was under German control, she was vulnerable to cooperate with the Nazis. A very believable reason from an allied country, which seemed to be the catalyst for Britain and America to begin to believe this too. Quote, the issue had become not whether she spied for Germany, but how she could possibly have avoided doing so. Soon she was banned entirely from travel and was forced to remain in exile in America. Chapter 8. Exile. Subject is not a sympathetic person and very seldom charms people. She is clumsy socially and has offended the fashion world with such statements as, American women don't know how to dress. Suspect has appeared to be very sad and embittered about life in general. She has stated that she will never make another dress, and that also it is impossible for her to work here because of her enemies in the fashion world. This is a quote directly from an informant to the FBI during Schiaparelli's exile. The investigation had turned sour. Everyone she knew was interviewed, even her postman, and it spawned investigations in Newark, Princeton, Ridgefield, Middleton, Los Angeles, and more. To their surprise, not one of the people that actually knew her, most of whom had their names protected, corroborated what the FBI was expecting to hear. In fact, by all accounts, they were better advocates of her position than she had been herself. Schiap, always aloof and ever traveling, was actively bad at not raising suspicion, because she was a most obvious type. Her actions were clumsy, and they were foolish, leading to suspicion. But, as you and I know, she had always been outspoken against Mussolini and definitely on the left politically, a fact that finally the investigation was beginning to show. It was becoming clear that she had really only ever been social with the Vichy crowd because she had to be to save her business, not only from the Nazis, but also from Mussolini, who also had long tried to force her to set up shop in Paris. Even her anti-British sentiments told to friends could be explained because Henry had just embezzled all the money from her London company and forced it to go out of business at exactly the time that she was under investigation. Frankly, unlike so many, it was very clear that Schiap was anti-Nazi, and it was becoming increasingly clear that these rumors had come from so-called friends in New York who had their own motives for getting Schiap out the picture. In fact, one was even named in the investigation as Sophie Gimbel, wife of the president of Saks Fifth Avenue, Adam Gimbel, who had been trying to use the war to oust French design in place of American designers.
One more quick pause. It's very interesting that Schiaparelli was not on the side of the Germans, although she was suspected of it. But Chanel, we now have learned later on that she was very closely tied to the Nazis during the war. So it's interesting that those two were even rivals when it came to politics. All right.
In the end, it became clear from their investigation that she had a reason to be pissed at the British and she had a reason to play the fence. What she didn't have was reason to so openly support America and France against the Nazis all of this time, even before the investigation, as that would have raised more obvious suspicion than anything she was doing otherwise. Really, the only unexplained thing that came from the investigation was her strange South American trip, which, as I said, would continue to be a bit of a stain on her record and really meant that the case just could not be closed. As such, she was forced to stay in exile as the British continued attempting to freeze her funds in New York, have them sent to England, and use them for the war effort. They were eventually successful too and claimed $55,000 from underneath her, the equivalent of about $1 million today.
Wow.
As it was, it took until January 1943 for the freeze to be lifted, though again the investigation remained open. In fact, despite incessant attempts to leave, she was forced to remain in exile in America until the 9th of March 1944, at which time she was finally permitted to leave. And just in time, too. By the 6th of June 1944, Nazis had announced that all Paris fashion houses had to close. Devastating news, no doubt. However, by August 1944, Paris was already liberated by their allies, freeing the couturiers from their obligations. This news was obviously front page for every newspaper. But incredibly, on the front page of the American Journal, Schiap found an article from a journalist that had gained access to her Rue de Berry home, and it contained greetings and well wishes from staff which ensured her that the house was safe. She could finally return home. The only problem was the Chambre syndicale de la couture had newly arrived in New York to revive relations between the countries, and they wanted to meet her. Now it was them that accused Schiap of not helping their cause during the war by designing in Paris, and instead accused her of working with American manufacturers on democratizing, popularizing, and developing the Schiaparelli style. Of course, she hadn't. She hadn't done any design work, save for the one uniform for the Salvation Army. She had been purposefully careful about that, in fact. But the new designs in America had been undoubtedly produced in a style that mimicked hers, even if she had nothing to do with them. She was absolutely livid. It wasn't her fault if they had copied. She had protected the name of French fashion endlessly by refusing to return until the war ended. She had always maintained that the best fashion was in Paris and had even continued to say as such under investigation and under exile. She really felt that this investigation from the Chambre syndicale de la couture was extremely unfair. Also, because of this utter madness, Schiaparelli was forced to wait in New York for yet another year until Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. Finally, somewhat against their wishes, she boarded the SS Mariposa on the 2nd of July 1945 from Boston and travelled first class back to Paris. She was finally free. Chapter 9. The Post-War, the Demise, and the Death. When Schiaparelli returned to Paris, she arrived unannounced. Her first stop, of course, was her boutique, lovingly kept running by Monsieur Meunier, who had kept the accounts perfectly and showed a healthy profit, thanks largely to the perfumes, and Irene Dana, who was so successful that, to her surprise, saw the store hosted a queue out the door and down the street of army men quietly waiting to bring perfumes and hats back for their lovers. She instantly doubled their wages. Meanwhile, her home, which had been taken over by Germans and Italians, was almost untouched, save for a series of photograph cards of French celebrities that the Nazis hosted while she was away. A list of names that she was very sure to note never to invite again.
Yeah.
Finally, everything had been made good. She found inspiration for her design work once more, her assets unfrozen, and if stored with friends or companies, returned to her without any pain. She finally was ready to make her return to French haute couture. But make no hesitation, she never forgot this time in her life and the kindnesses that she had seen. So, to pay that forward, she endlessly continued her philanthropy. She set up workrooms at Place Vendôme where they could repair or make clothes from damaged or secondhand pieces, then gift them to the people in the north of France who had been the most affected by the war. She gave shows to recovering American troops in hospitals and visited the nurseries for the endless newborn babies. She was even invited by Neiman Marcus to Dallas, Texas, to become an honorary citizen. But most importantly, having lost Paul Poiret in the previous year, she donned a Poiret black ensemble and went alone to his grave to pay her respects. However, with all of this post-war calm came the very infamous trials to determine who was and who was not involved with the Nazis during the war. And as you may recall, Schiaparelli had long been seen as suspicious. Of course, we have discussed in detail all of the suspicions that the authorities had of Schiap, but the world of haute couture had had so many collaborators. There was really no escape from a report. Fortunately for Schiap, despite the wartime investigation, she truly had been working with the Allies endlessly. What had really annoyed people about those like Chanel was that she was almost cocky in her allegiance to the Nazis, eating in fine restaurants and openly entering relationships with them. But Schiap didn't do any of that. And apart from the rumors, there was nothing concrete to turn the public and the investigators against her. It also undoubtedly helped that she was a famous couturier, as the famous saw far more leniency to the investigations than the similarly on-the-fence but lower-level workers. Even Schiap did far more suspicious things than some of those found guilty. But, like with most things, the law favors those it needs. And frankly, France was bankrupt. If they wanted to survive post-war, they needed exportable goods, of which couture had been for decades one of their top 5, with Schiap right at the very top of the pile. So she was cleared of any wrongdoing whatsoever and left to help bolster French design once more. To return the haute couture to good stature was going to be difficult for everyone. The Nazis may not have migrated French couture as planned, but they had successfully decimated its access to materials, which had destroyed it nonetheless. In order to rebuild, the couturiers needed money, which, because they had such little material, they basically needed to make out of thin air. Eventually, the idea for the return, in fact, would come from a man named Christian Berard, who was actually an illustrator of the croquis and couture, and proposed the idea of using poupées, which are a kind of small doll used to show off couture designs to customers in the years before photography, in an exhibition around the theme of Le Théâtre de la Mode, in which each couturier and artist would make 1 or 2 designs through which they could effectively show off their newest fashions at a fraction of the production cost. The dolls were tiny after all. These featured wasp-waisted, full-skirted silhouettes, and the entire show was a massive sensation that almost immediately returned Parisian haute couture to its former glory.
Sorry, I'm pausing again. That so reminds me of the Jeremy Scott collection that he did for Moschino during the pandemic, where he did all dolls. They were all like marionette dolls, and he even had one of Anna Wintour. It was the cutest collection, and I think that should be the way to go back to that, because it's so unique and it saves so much money when you're producing on a smaller scale before you start producing it for your clients. So, all right, pause for that. If you've never seen that Jeremy Scott for Moschino, I'll try to find it and link it in the description box for this video, because it's such a great collection and it's so fun to watch.
But something had changed with Schiaparelli. She had been out of the game for 5 years, and though magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar remained loyal, it was clear that her designs just didn't hit the right spot anymore. Socially, she was still very much adored, but her actual design work left much to be desired. Honestly, though, that's not quite true, at least at first. Because depending on the source that you read, Schiaparelli's post-war designs could have been the best thing since sliced bread, or more dated than a date. There's not really a lot of in-between in recordings of this. Even the more trusted sources don't seem to conclusively agree if she was popular again or not. So it leaves me to believe that the reviews were just mixed, and that in comparison to how she was positively perceived before the war, this was a shock, and looked to be both good or bad depending on your perspective. But, just for reference, Schiaparelli herself remembers good reviews, Seacrest quotes Vogue with a good review, while White and most of the other books referenced say her designs were lacking, specifically as the audience expected to see American influence that just never came. Though to confuse us even further, Seacrest almost doubles back on their positive acceptance claims after they go on to say that her inspiration in surrealism was long dated. So as a result, it just seems inconclusive if she was successful or not, and you may read into that whatever you wish. Really, the only undeniable change at this point was that clients were fewer and the costs had majorly increased. Dresses that were once selling for 20,000 francs eventually became 100 to 300,000 francs. And in the post-war, this just seemed frivolous and honestly extortionate. It's also true that new couturiers had arrived in the dawn, and specifically Dior was taking the couture world by storm. I often get negative reviews when I say this, but his new look from 1947 firstly wasn't new at all. It already existed on the poupées we just talked about. He just made the look in a more extravagant way. And secondly, he and his design were quite strategically chosen to become famous. They knew the idea had a shock factor for which it was bound to draw attention, and they specifically chose to promote it heavily because it pushed the same pre-World War I idea that the Nazis too believed, that women should be domestically kept. This was in line with his own conservative ideals, for Dior was working with Nazi wives very happily before he gained fame, as well as the ideals of women of his cotton baron backer Marcel Boussac, and it was he that provided the material for such a consumptive look, something that it's assumed he would not have done if the design was more liberal. It seems impossible to think now, as countless books, articles, and journals have been written about how women wanted to return to a simpler life, with the new look adopted by Dior as evidence. But this actually doesn't seem to be true. Even in the 20s, women pushed against this idea, let alone now in the 40s. Instead, it's much more likely some kind of pro-French couture propaganda that the Federation allowed because it so heavily was backed by Boussac. He could single-handedly afford to return couture to where it was through promotion, and that would go on and benefit everyone. In the end, at its best, it was just following the lines of fashion at the time in a more conservative way, but also in a way that was much more attention-grabbing. And at worst, it presented some kind of symbol for those that remained loyal. I'm sure there's a spectrum there, obviously, and those that did buy probably did so for multiple reasons. But in the end, it's at least undeniable that after this fad died out in the later 1950s, corsets have never truly returned to popularity in the way they once had. But of course, with all of that said, by then it was far too late for Schiaparelli. Throughout the 40s, sales had slowed. Costs were never really gotten under control, and she returned to spending recklessly. I assume Monsieur Meunier had also left at this time as well, which may have factored, because in 1947 she would hire a young Hubert de Givenchy, who was said to be horrified at her finances, taking it upon himself to try to quell her spending. Really, it seems the 40s were a very difficult decade for Schiap. There was obviously the war ending, then she returned to her business, which was on rocky ground, and now there was new competition on the horizon. If it wasn't for a surprise reunion with her daughter, this would no question be one of the hardest decades of her life. As it was, however, 3 days after Dior's debut, on the 15th of February 1947, Gogo would give birth to her first child, Marissa Berenson, prompting her to get back in touch with her mum. Soon after, on the 4th of April 1948, her second grandchild, Berinthia Berenson, always known as Berry, would also join the family. By 1951, it was time for Givenchy to make his own way in the world. It was really this, more than anything else, that marked to Scap the end of her run. She knew he was talented and knew he was exactly what the world needed. She was finally passé, but she was okay with it. Of course, she had tried to get Givenchy to stay. She was distraught when he left and openly offered him to take over her company. But now she had shown her final collection in 1954. It really was the end. Plus, as an added humiliation, it was also in 1954 that Chanel was able to return, though considering how their acquaintanceship ended, with Chanel being exiled out of France after the war due to her collusion, it likely came at a relief that Chanel's return was mocked rather widely. Schiaparelli, in that regard, was more successful than Chanel. Even without her maison, she successfully maintained her social position and continued to be far better liked than Chanel for many, many years. Even Vogue continued to push her licensed products until 1965. She also became known for being a proponent of the new couturiers, wearing Givenchy endlessly to promote his design, as well as then newcomer Yves Saint Laurent, who credited Scap as inspiration to countless designs, including his very famous Le Smoking, which was a concept first designed by Scap in 1936. Eventually, she bought a small beach house in Tunisia and began spending far more time there. It certainly reads as if, by the time that Givenchy left, she was beginning to settle down, potentially to use this home as a retirement, though she never did. Her business changed strategies to working largely with licensed products too, none of which designed by Schiaparelli herself. But now over 60, Scap just knew it was her time and was accepting of it. This may, of course, be because she was making more money than ever due to licenses and due to new mass-produced Schiaparelli diffusion lines in the US. But in my opinion, I think it was a lesson learned from Poiret. She saw how hard he had grappled with falling from the top, and perhaps intrinsically knew then that this was just the circle of couture. That did not, however, stop her from emulating Poiret's awfully frivolous spending habits, causing Schiaparelli Incorporated to go gravely into debt, supported almost entirely by perfumes, in fact. Eventually, suppliers refused to extend credit, she couldn't make payments, and by 1954, Schiaparelli finally was forced to close its doors of and Place Vendôme, and its Schiaparelli Inc. purely into a licensing brand. This included, but was not limited to, sunglasses, costume jewelry, men's ties, wigs, earrings, Playtex girdles, Q-Tex nail polish, Glentex scarves, Kimberly-Clark, Form Fit, wireless foods, Nomata yarns, Congress playing cards, Arco playing cards, Sealy mattresses, Longines watches, paper dolls, real dolls, Catalina swimsuits, doe-skin gloves, fabrics, furs, stationery, shower curtains, cars, eyeglasses, table linens, lingerie, VAT 69 scotch, Good Luck margarine, Kraft Italian dressing, Westcott hosiery mills, menswear ties, cufflinks, handbags, hats, fine jewelry, shoes, and chewing gum. Meanwhile, Gogo, her husband, Marissa, and Berry were pretty firmly back in Schiaparelli's life. She may have seen her business close, but she was still very much full of life and spent holidays with them at Closters, Saint-Tropez, and Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat. In fact, Scap really never stopped traveling, but she also never really got that close to her grandchildren either. They were around 7 or 8 at this time and also not close to their mother Gogo. Like their mother, they were bitter about the fact that they had been shipped off to boarding schools and finishing schools, but unlike the multiple visits Gogo recalls during her school years, seeing their mother, they were only allowed every 2 or 3 years. This separation also wasn't meant to change anytime soon. Throughout their teenage years, they're quoted saying that they had little to do with Scap, though they were happy to take her gifts and stay at her home, Rue de Berry in Paris, as long as they could use the private entrance and use the service elevator, which Marissa did for at least 3 years. In this regard, Scap seemed rather permissible, only really stepping in when Marissa wanted to become a model, which still then in the early 60s was not a desirable profession for the elite. Of course, her opinion may have changed after Marissa found worldwide fame as a model and soon turned that success into an even more successful film career. You might even know her, actually. She was in 1972's Cabaret, for which she earned nominations at the Golden Globes and the BAFTAs, and she was on the cover of Vogue and in the Diana Vreeland documentary, which is one of my personal favorites. But still back in 1962, this was of course yet to happen, and she began to become concerned about their financial future. Schiaparelli knew her time was coming to an end, but she desperately and knowingly tried to hold on in order to oversee her daughter and her husband and her grandchildren get back to a better place. Unfortunately, this didn't happen soon enough, and Robert Berenson would pass away in 1965 from a surprise illness. By around 1966, Schiap had now paid off all of her debts from the business with her personal profits from Parfum Schiaparelli, and was soon quoted saying that she was not sorry to close her business. She knew it was the right time. Unlike so many, Schiap seemed openly unbothered by the fact that she was a has-been. She just didn't care. She had lived a great life and was satisfied. By 1972, at the grand old age of 82, Schiap had a pulmonary embolism. She recovered, but small incidents followed. Soon Schiap was having trouble getting around, the stairs too tough and the elevator broken. She had to make the hard decision to sell her beloved Rue de Berry house. The following September 1972, still in the midst of selling, she had another stroke. She was rushed to hospital, paralyzed on one side, and she fell into a coma. As she awakened, she was delicately moved back to her home bed, and at 83, with Marissa by her bedside, she begins to call out for her very first love, the boy that tried to woo her with the tuberoses. Pino, she cried. Pino, is that you? Marissa then held her hand, and she passed away into death on the 13th of November, 1973. That December, a mass was held for her at Saint-Philippe-de-Roule, and crowds turned up to bid her farewell. Her grave was marked by a bare Picard cross and a plain graphite slab with the florid signature that she had traced in gold. Standing beside the grave during the simple burial ceremony was Gogo with her new husband, Gino Cacipuotti, Arustag Michelian, Michele Guegan, Yvonne Faith Sauquier, Roger Jean-Pierre, and Paulette Laperche, all of whom loyal to Schiap right until the end. Thank you so much for watching this video. As you can tell, it was a real labor of love, and I just hope you got to learn more about the wonderful Elsa Schiaparelli's life because this video exists. Please do like and subscribe for more videos like this one. It really genuinely does help me out so much. And if you're interested in beauty brands, I do also have a beauty channel called Underskin that I really recommend to you as well. A particularly special thanks goes out to my patrons over on Patreon, some of whose names are on the screen now. Thank you again for watching. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.
In the glittering world of high fashion, a few family names.
Well, she did amazing. I have no complaints. Sorry, now I've got all this in my eye. She did an amazing job. Really great. Sorry, I'm gonna get this moisturizer out of my eye. I think that the creator, Understitch, is the name of the channel. She did an amazing job on tonight's video. And sadly, there was a lot of it that I didn't get to watch, but I will watch it on the replay because there was some really fascinating moments there. I also was able to do all of my skincare. It was a good self-care night. I mean, we did, we cleansed the face, steamed the face. I did a peel, the ordinary, it's like a glycolic peel. And then what did we do after that? We did our LED mask. I had it on the cell rejuvenating mode, and then the lip mask. Then we did the hand mask. I'm actually going to, because there's still some goodness in these little gloves, I'm going to wear them overnight. They just make your hands feel unbelievable. And I don't know if you noticed, but I was really working it into all the dry areas of my hands. That was awesome sauce. Let's see. We cleansed the face. We used our micellar water to cleanse the face. Then we put on the Bliss. This mask is actually the holographic foil sheet mask for brightening. There's still some goodness down in the pack of this that let's go ahead and put it on. Let's go ahead and open it up. Because if you know, you know, when you get these sheet masks, there's always the goodness that's still inside the pack. And from what I can feel, there's still a lot of juice. Oh man, a lot of juice down in there. So much so that I'm actually going to save what's left in here and add it to my skincare tomorrow night. Yeah, there's a lot of goodness still left in here. So I'm just going to put it in my skincare container. This is my skincare container. It has everything I need every day, my deodorant, my sunscreen, lotion, all that good fun stuff. I also then did all of my moisturizers. Started off with my retinol. I'm almost out of this, but I just got a new retinol. Then I went in with the snail mucin, the regular one. Then I went in with my Cosmetica hyaluronic acid. Then I went in with the other snail mucin. Then I went in with the fresh rose. This is like a deep hydration sleeping mask. So finished off with that. Annoyingly, I did not take the cap off my Smith's Rosebud Minted Lip Balm. And if you know, you know, this thing, if your hands have the slightest bit of moisture, you're never going to get it open. It's virtually impossible. Well, man, and then I just added a little bit of that extra juice that was in that mask. And yeah, we're looking good. The last final step that I'm going to do, I have to grab it out of the refrigerator. While we wrap up this video, I'm actually going to put the retinol back in the refrigerator because that's where it needs to be stored. I even got in a dinner, a pizza. I'm on glass number 2 of my adult grape juice. It's a good night. Relit some more incense. We're good to go. The last step in the skincare routine are the facial rollers. I've got one in jade, and I keep them in the fridge so they're ice cold. And that's going to close all the pores from our steam earlier, from our LED mask. Any areas that the pores are still open, this is going to just close them all up. Yeah, don't forget the neck and the jawline. But tonight's movie was great. I definitely have to watch it back in the playback because there was a lot that I missed, having to go back and forth to the kitchen, back and forth to my bathroom. And so I did definitely miss out on some areas that I definitely would love to know more about. I just think it's really funny after we covered Chanel, you know, that they had such a rivalry pretty much their entire careers. So I think that's interesting. Let's see what else is left. I mean, we really did a good movie night. I know it's probably late for most people. I just got a bell. What was that bell for? Was that my nighttime bell? Nope, that was my nighttime skincare routine bell on my Google Mini, Home Mini. And yeah, we're doing the skincare now. So we're right on track. Annoyingly, I do have some more work to do after this video, but we're going to try to wrap it up here. Okay, after the the jade roller, I'm going to put that on the side so I can sterilize it for the next use. We go in with the rose quartz roller. This one I got from Sephora. The jade one I got here in Belize. If you watched last week, I did an entire updated nighttime skincare routine. So most of the moisturizing steps were in that video. But it definitely had some different steps than we did tonight. We want to get that neck, get the chest. And it's so cold. As soon as it stops being cold, you know you're done. Go across those lips. Don't forget about it. And then last bit is the eyes. Ice cold. Freezing up those 11s. Freezing up those crow's feet. And we did a good moisturizer. Now, next week, I'm not going to reveal what movie I'm going to do, mostly because I'm not really sure. There's so many good ones. I could do Dior. I just found a bunch of stuff on Galliano. We could do Yves Saint Laurent. We could do Dior. Oh, I said Dior already. So there are quite a few fashion movies in the pipeline. I also want to do a night dedicated to Anna Wintour because I found a bunch of videos related to her. So definitely join me for next week's movie night. Although I don't know what it's going to be, it's still going to be a fun Saturday self-care night where we get to learn about fashion and just relax into our weekend. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Today was National Shapewear Day. Like I said, I did do a video on the history of the corset. So please make sure to go and check that out. It's actually connected to a blog that AbFab Designs, my company, we put together. And so it sort of relates to that. So there's the blog and the video all relating to National Shapewear Day, which is now technically over in the States, but there's still about an hour and a half left of Shapewear Day for us. But I did want to thank you all so much for watching, showing my videos so much love. I have noticed that you guys really are enjoying these fashion movie nights, so I'm going to continue to do them. I certainly am getting a lot out of them. First of all, it's just a great way for me to have a night of just self-care where I know I can just sit back, watch a movie, drink a little adult grape juice, algorithm gods, and come and enjoy a great fashion movie with you guys. I'm still trying to open up this Mented lip balm. I may never get it open. I just want to get some moisturizer on my lips. So I'm going to go in with my e.l.f. Ride or Die lip balm in the shade Boss Berry. But I really do like to use that mented salve. But I try to open it before I start my skincare. I'm just using my computer monitor as a mirror here. Oh, I almost forgot. Last step in the skincare. is this essential oil, the cinnamon pure essential oil. Oh, that just puts me to sleep. That gets me ready for bed. I just get some drops across the chest, and it just soothes everything. Now, if you know, you know, if you watch my skincare video, this is a warming oil. If you're not used to it, dilute it with a plain oil, because otherwise it will feel really hot. Really, really hot. But that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to warm the skin, get you ready for bed, get it all in the chest area, all up around the neck. And it's just going to give you that scent to just put you right out. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to put my little hand mask back on, maybe watch a little bit of TV and call it a night. I thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, hit that notification bell. I'm not sure what tomorrow's video is going to be, but I think I'm going to do a live face mask video instead of putting up a regular video. I may put up another little short video tomorrow, but I'm running out of content to post. I need to get to filming. So I am going to spend all day tomorrow filming. So there will definitely be some great content coming very soon. Also, I'm going to start doing a weekend review. Maybe I'll do that on Sundays for the live. I'm not really sure how I'm going to produce that, but I do want to let you guys know, like, what the blogs that are coming up for AFAB Designs, what videos I have coming up on the channel. And yeah, I just want to be able to do a weekend review so you guys know what's coming up. Any social media holidays that are coming up for the week. Like Prosecco Day is coming up, and I'm a Prosecco girl, so I'm not sure if I'm going to do a live or whatever, but I bought a bottle of Prosecco. And I don't want to have to wait until Saturday movie night to drink it. So I'll figure that out. But again, thank you all so much for watching Saturday movie night. I know it was a long one. Go off to bed and enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll see you guys next week. Don't forget, I've got yoga on Thursdays, and those have been doing really, really well. I'm starting to get a little bit of following for those yoga live sessions, so please make sure to join me. Subscribe, hit the notification bell so you know exactly when it's going to go up, and I'll see you guys next week. Good night, everyone. I gotta end my